Before we begin, if you're enjoying this content, please consider using your hype points on this video. It really helps the channel more than you could possibly know. If you're listening on Spotify, leaving a review helps out so much as well. Also, feel free to comment what time it is for you and where in the world you're listening from, but only if you want to. We absolutely love seeing where everyone is tuning in from. And of course, if you enjoy the content, subscribing really helps us keep bringing you these stories. Now let's get into tonight's investigation. A huge thank you to Justin for suggesting this topic. This one's fascinating, and honestly, it might be one of the most important stories we've ever covered. Imagine being the most decorated soldier in your nation's history. You've bled for your country on 4 different continents, led men through hell, earned the highest honours your military can bestow not once but twice. Now imagine that the wealthiest men in America approach you in secret with a proposal that would change everything. They want you to lead 500,000 armed veterans in a march on the nation's capital. They want you to force the president into submission. They want you to install yourself as a military dictator backed by the largest corporations in the country. This isn't fiction. This isn't speculation. This is the sworn testimony of a man who had no reason to lie and everything to lose by speaking. The year was 1934 and America came within a conversation of becoming a fascist state. The men who planned it walked free. Their names were largely protected. And the story was buried so thoroughly that most Americans have never heard of it. Until now. Prologue. The most decorated Marine speaks out. November 20th, 1934. Washington. The halls of Congress rarely deal in sensational claims. Procedures, budgets, debates over policy. These are the standard fare. Senators and representatives have heard wild accusations before. Conspiracy theories, political grandstanding, attention-seeking witnesses looking for their moment in the spotlight. The committees have learned to filter noise from signal. So when a retired Major General requests to give testimony about an attempted overthrow of the government, the initial response is skepticism. Another crank with delusions of importance. Another veteran unable to adjust to civilian life, seeing conspiracies in every shadow. Then someone looks at the name on the testimony request, Smedley Darlington Butler. The room changes. Suddenly this is not a routine hearing. Butler does not arrive with bodyguards, though given what he is about to say, perhaps he should. He does not bring lawyers or prepared statements crafted by political handlers. He does not have a book to sell or a political career to launch. He walks in alone, a man in his 50s with the bearing of someone who has spent his entire adult life in service to his country. The committee members know who Butler is. Every military officer in America knows who Butler is. He has earned the Medal of Honor twice. Only a handful of men in American history can make that claim. He has fought in China, Nicaragua, Haiti, and the trenches of World War I. He has commanded thousands of men in combat. He has been offered promotions to the highest ranks and turned them down because he disagreed with the politics behind them. Presidents have shaken his hand. And now he's about to tell Congress that some of the wealthiest and most powerful men in America tried to recruit him to lead a military coup. The committee chairman, Representative John McCormack, calls the hearing to order. Butler is sworn in. His voice is steady as he begins to speak, not angry, not fearful, simply factual, the way a military officer delivers a situation report. He provides names: Gerald McGuire, a bond salesman with connections to Wall Street. Specific dates: summer of 1933. Multiple meetings at his home in Pennsylvania. He describes conversations that began innocuously, about veteran organizations and political influence, that gradually escalated into something far more sinister. Butler tells them about trips McGuire made to Europe, studying how Mussolini organized his fascist state in Italy, how Hitler was consolidating power in Germany. He describes plans to recruit 500,000 veterans, men who trusted him, men who had followed him into battle, men who would follow him one more time. But this time, the battle would not be against a foreign enemy. This time, the battle would be for control of America itself. The plan, as Butler describes it, was sophisticated. Not a violent overthrow, not tanks in the streets, something more subtle. A massive peaceful march on Washington, that would nevertheless carry the implicit threat of overwhelming military force. The imagery alone would be powerful. 500,000 trained soldiers, many of them desperate and angry about the Depression, united behind the most famous general in America. And what would they demand? According to Maguire's alleged pitch, they would force President Franklin Roosevelt to appoint a Secretary of General Affairs, a new position that would effectively run the government. Roosevelt would remain as president in name, a figurehead for public consumption. But real power would shift to this new office, and who would hold this position? Butler himself. The committee members leaned forward. This is not the rambling of a disturbed mind. This is specific. This is detailed. This is, if true, an actual attempted coup. Butler does not speculate about motives. He does not editorialize. He simply lays out the facts as he experienced them. Who contacted him, what they said, what they offered, what they planned. He tells them he did not agree. That he continued meeting with Maguire, gathering information, trying to understand the full scope of what was being proposed, and that when he finally understood how serious this was, he knew he had only one option: expose it. Butler does not ask for protection. He does not demand action. He simply presents his testimony and waits for Congress to respond. The committee will investigate. They will interview witnesses. They will examine documents. They will attempt to corroborate Butler's extraordinary claims. And in the end, they will confirm that discussions about removing President Franklin Roosevelt did indeed take place. They will state explicitly that a fascist organisation was planned and might have been executed. But no one will be prosecuted. No major financiers will be subpoenaed. No corporate executives will face charges. And the story will quietly disappear from the headlines, buried beneath other news, forgotten by a public already overwhelmed by economic catastrophe. This is the story of the business plot, the coup that almost was, the conspiracy that involved some of the most powerful men in America, the warning that we ignored, and the question of whether it could happen again. Chapter 1. America on the Brink. To understand why anyone would even consider overthrowing the American government, you have to understand what America looked like in the early 1930s, and more importantly, you have to understand how terrified the wealthy elite were of what was happening. The Great Depression has destroyed the country, not metaphorically, not in an exaggerated sense. It has genuinely devastated the nation in ways that most modern Americans cannot fully comprehend. Unemployment exceeds 25%. That's 1 in 4 working-age Americans without a job. In some cities, the number is closer to 40%. No unemployment insurance exists. No federal safety net, no food stamps or welfare programs. If you lose your job, you lose everything. Your home, your savings, your future. Banks are collapsing at an unprecedented rate. Between 1930 and 1933, over 9,000 banks fail. 9,000. People's life savings vanish overnight. Elderly couples who spent decades building retirement funds find themselves destitute. Small businesses close because they cannot access credit. Farms are foreclosed by the thousands. Hunger is everywhere. Breadlines stretch for blocks in every major city. Children go to school with empty stomachs. Families survive on bread and watered-down soup. Malnutrition rates skyrocket. People are literally starving in the richest country in the world. Shanty towns spring up on the edges of cities, makeshift communities of cardboard and scrap metal that people sarcastically call Hoovervilles after President Herbert Hoover, who many blame for the crisis. Families live in shacks made from packing crates. Children play in dirt streets. Disease spreads, and the government does virtually nothing. In the summer of 1932, something happens that shakes the nation's confidence even further. Thousands of World War I veterans march on Washington demanding early payment of bonuses they were promised for their service. These are not radicals. These are not communists or anarchists. These are soldiers who fought for America, who risked their lives in France, who came home to a country that thanked them with parades and then forgot about them. Now they are desperate. Many are homeless. Their families are hungry. The bonus payments are not due until 1945, but they need help now. They set up camps in Washington, peaceful protests asking their government for assistance. The government's response reveals how deeply the elite fear popular movements. President Hoover orders the military to clear the camps. General Douglas MacArthur, who will play his own role in conspiracy theories throughout his career, leads the operation. Tanks roll through the streets of Washington. Soldiers use tear gas on veterans. Cavalry charges disperse crowds. The camps are burned. Men who fought for their country are treated like enemy combatants. This event is critical to understanding the business plot. It proves that the military will fire on American citizens if ordered. It demonstrates that when the establishment feels threatened, it responds with force, and it creates a deep reservoir of anger among veterans that men like Butler could potentially tap into. This is the America that Franklin Delano Roosevelt inherits when he takes office in March 1933. Roosevelt moves fast. Within his first 100 days, he launches the New Deal, a sweeping series of programs designed to pull America out of the Depression. Federal spending increases dramatically. New agencies are created: the Civilian Conservation Corps, the Works Progress Administration, the Social Security Administration. Banking regulations are imposed through the Glass-Steagall Act. Labour unions gain protection through the National Industrial Recovery Act. The government expands its role in the economy in ways that would have been unthinkable just years before. For millions of suffering Americans, Roosevelt is a saviour. His fireside chats on the radio provide hope. His programs provide jobs. His rhetoric provides dignity to the unemployed and dispossessed. For the wealthy elite, however, Roosevelt is something far more dangerous. He is a traitor to his class. Roosevelt comes from old money. His family is part of the American aristocracy. He attended the best schools. He married into the right circles. By all rights, he should be defending the interests of his class against the demands of the masses. Instead, he is siding with the masses against his own class. Corporate executives watch in horror as their power is curtailed. Banking elites see their freedom to operate without oversight disappear. Industrialists face new regulations and union protections that threaten profit margins. These men have spent decades building empires with minimal government interference, and now a president is telling them that the rules have changed, that workers have rights, that the government can regulate business, that profit cannot be the only consideration. To many wealthy Americans, this is not reform. This is socialism. This is the first step toward communism. This is the end of everything they have built. Some of them begin to look elsewhere for solutions. Across the Atlantic Ocean, a different kind of government is rising. In Italy, Benito Mussolini has created a fascist state that promises order, discipline, and most importantly for business interests, the complete suppression of labour movements and socialist organising. Strikes are illegal. Unions are controlled by the state. Workers are disciplined. Trains run on time, and corporate profits are protected by military force. In Germany, Adolf Hitler is consolidating power through a similar model. He crushes the Communist Party, destroys independent unions, and creates a system where business and government work hand in hand, as long as business understands who is really in charge. And some American elites are watching, not with horror, with interest, with a growing sense that perhaps this model could work in America. These European governments don't have labour strikes. They don't have socialist movements threatening to redistribute wealth. They don't have presidents who side with workers over owners. They have strong leaders who keep business running smoothly, who suppress dissent efficiently, who promise stability even at the cost of freedom. If it can work there, some begin to wonder, why not here? The ground is fertile for something unprecedented in American history. The economy is shattered. Trust in government is eroding. Millions of veterans trained in combat and accustomed to following orders are unemployed and angry. And the president is implementing policies that threaten the very foundation of corporate power. All it would take is the right leader. Someone with credibility among veterans. Someone who could be presented as saving America rather than destroying it. Someone who veterans would follow without question. Someone exactly like Smedley Butler. The question was not whether someone would try. The question was when and how carefully they would plan it. Chapter 2. Who was Smedley Butler, Smedley Darlington Butler was born in 1881 in Westchester, Pennsylvania. His father, Thomas Butler, was a lawyer who would eventually serve in the US House of Representatives for over 30 years. His mother came from a prominent Quaker family, people of peace who nevertheless understood duty and service. The family was respectable, educated, politically connected. Young Smedley could have chosen any number of comfortable careers: law, politics, business. A life of ease and influence awaited him. Instead, at age 16, he lied about his age and enlisted in the Marine Corps during the Spanish-American War. This decision would define everything that followed. Butler's military career reads like something out of an adventure novel, except every word is documented military history. He serves in Honduras, Nicaragua, Panama, Mexico, Haiti, and China. He fights in the Boxer Rebellion, where foreign powers carve up China like a pie, and Butler sees firsthand how military force serves economic interests. He participates in the occupation of Veracruz during the Mexican Revolution. He helps suppress rebellions in Haiti, an occupation that will later haunt his conscience. He earns the Medal of Honor not once, but twice. The first comes in 1914 during the Veracruz incident. The second comes in 1915 in Haiti. He is one of only 19 men in American history to receive this distinction twice. Even among this elite group, Butler stands out for the sheer number of combat situations he survives. Stories about Butler become legend among Marines. Once, while fighting in Haiti against rebel forces, he personally led his men in an assault on a fortress built into a mountain. The approach was up a sheer cliff face under heavy fire. Butler climbed ahead of his troops, drawing fire, refusing to order men into danger he wouldn't face himself. When they took the fortress, Butler's uniform was torn and burned from bullets that nearly killed him. Another time, during an operation in China, Butler learned that a railway was being used to transport rebel reinforcements. Rather than engage in a prolonged battle, he simply had his men tear up several miles of track overnight. The reinforcements never arrived. The rebellion collapsed without a major fight. But Butler is more than just brave. He is genuinely concerned about his men in a way that is unusual for officers of his era. He fights constantly for better conditions, better equipment, better pay. He personally inspects food supplies and medical facilities. He writes letters to the families of men killed under his command. Marines under his command know that their general will not waste their lives unnecessarily, and that he will be right there with them when danger comes. By the 1920s, Butler is one of the most famous military figures in America. He is appointed Director of Public Safety in Philadelphia, where he attempts to clean up rampant corruption in the police department. He makes enemies among political bosses and organised crime figures by actually enforcing laws. After 2 years, the pressure becomes too great and he returns to military service. He gives speeches across the country. Veterans admire him. The public knows his name. He's offered promotions to the highest ranks of the Marine Corps, but turns them down when he disagrees with the politics behind them. Then something changes in Butler's perspective. As he looks back at his decades of service, he begins to see patterns that disturb him profoundly. He realizes that many of the military operations he participated in were not about defending America. They were about defending American corporate interests abroad. He helped suppress revolutions that threatened American companies. He protected banana plantations in Central America. He secured mining rights in Haiti. He ensured that American banks could collect debts from foreign governments. He begins speaking out about this. Not quietly, not tactfully, loudly and publicly. In 1935, he'll publish a short book called War is a Racket. In it, he'll write something that shocks many Americans. I spent 33 years and 4 months in active military service, and during that period I spent most of my time as a high-class muscle man for big business, for Wall Street and the bankers. In short, I was a racketeer, a gangster for capitalism. I helped make Mexico, especially Tampico, safe for American oil interests. I helped make Haiti and Cuba a decent place for the National City Bank boys to collect revenues in. I helped in the raping of 6 Central American republics for the benefit of Wall Street. The record of racketeering is long. This is not a minor figure making wild claims. This is one of the most decorated officers in American military history explicitly stating that he was used as an enforcer for corporate interests. But in 1933, when the approach comes, Butler is still a respected figure who has not yet fully articulated these ideas. He has retired from active duty but remains deeply connected to veteran communities. He gives speeches criticising corporate influence and war profiteering, but he is not considered radical or dangerous. He is simply a general speaking uncomfortable truths that most people choose to ignore. This makes him perfect for what comes next. He is famous enough to command instant loyalty from veterans across the country. He is critical enough of the establishment to seem like he might be sympathetic to dramatic change. He has demonstrated willingness to stand up to authority when he believes it is corrupt. But he is not so radical that approaching him would be obviously insane. Whoever decided to recruit Butler understood these factors carefully. They had done their research. They knew his background, his beliefs, his influence. They chose well. What they did not anticipate, what they could not have known, was that Butler's criticism of corporate power was not a performance. It was not positioning for future political office. It was not rhetorical flourish for applause at veteran gatherings. It was genuine conviction, born from decades of experience, from seeing how power really operates, from recognising his own role in a system he had come to despise. And when they approached him with their proposal, they would learn exactly how deep that conviction ran. They would learn that Smedley Butler could not be bought, could not be flattered into compliance, could not be convinced that overthrowing democracy was patriotic. They chose the right man for their purposes. They just chose the wrong man to trust. Chapter 3. The Approach. The first contact comes in the summer of 1933, just months after Roosevelt takes office and begins implementing the New Deal. Gerald Curly Maguire is a bond salesman working for Grayson M.P. Murphy and Company, a prestigious Wall Street brokerage firm. On the surface, there is nothing particularly remarkable about Maguire. He is 43 years old, well-dressed, well-spoken, the type of man who can move comfortably in rooms full of money and power without being the centre of attention. He is connected to the American Legion, one of the largest veteran organisations in the country, serving as commander of a Connecticut post. He moves in circles of wealth and influence, but is not himself a major figure. He is what intelligence operatives would call a cutout, someone who makes contact without revealing who is really behind the operation. Maguire approaches Butler with what seems, initially, like a modest and reasonable proposal. He wants Butler's help in influencing the American Legion's annual convention. The Legion is considering resolutions about monetary policy, specifically about whether America should return to the gold standard. This is not an obscure economic debate. The gold standard question represents a fundamental divide between different economic interests. Banks and wealthy bondholders favour gold because it protects their holdings from inflation. Workers and farmers oppose it because it makes debt harder to pay off and restricts government's ability to stimulate the economy. Maguire claims that he represents a group of wealthy Legion members who want to ensure the convention votes the right way. He offers Butler money to attend the convention and use his influence. It is presented as simple political organising, the kind of thing that happens all the time. Butler listens but is non-committal. Something about Maguire does not sit right with him. The offer seems reasonable on its face, but Butler has spent too many years around men with hidden agendas to take anything at face value. He senses something beneath the surface of this request, but cannot quite identify it. Maguire persists. Over the following months, he makes multiple visits to Butler's home in Newtown Square, Pennsylvania. Each time, he brings more information. Each time, the conversation evolves and deepens. What begins as discussions about the American Legion gradually transforms into something far more ambitious and far more dangerous. According to Butler's later testimony, Maguire begins describing trips to Europe. He claims to have travelled extensively, studying how different governments operate. He talks about Italy, where Mussolini has created a system that efficiently combines corporate interest with authoritarian control. He speaks admiringly of how Mussolini dealt with labour problems. He simply made strikes illegal and arrested union organisers. How Mussolini dealt with political opposition. he outlawed other parties and imprisoned dissidents, how Mussolini maintains order through paramilitary groups that enforce discipline with violence when necessary. Maguire is not critical of these methods. He presents them as solutions. Then Maguire starts talking about veterans, about how many former soldiers are unemployed and desperate, about how they feel betrayed by a government that sent them to war and then abandoned them during the Depression, about how they could be organised, mobilised, given purpose and direction again. 500,000 men, he suggests, maybe more, all veterans, all trained in military tactics, all potentially loyal to a leader they respect. The conversations become more explicit over time. Maguire describes a plan that has clearly been developed in detail, not improvised during their meetings. A march on Washington, he explains. Not violent, he insists repeatedly. Peaceful, but overwhelming. 500,000 veterans descending on the Capitol in a show of force that cannot be ignored. The imagery alone would be powerful. The implicit threat of what 500,000 trained soldiers could do if pushed would be even more powerful. And what would they demand? According to Butler's testimony, the goal is to force Roosevelt aside, not necessarily to remove him entirely, Maguire emphasises, as if this distinction makes the plan less treasonous. The president would remain as a figurehead, someone to give speeches and attend ceremonies, but real power would shift to a new position, Secretary of General Affairs, a person who would effectively run the government, make the actual decisions, control policy, while Roosevelt remains as a symbolic leader for public consumption. And who would be this Secretary of General Affairs? Maguire suggests that Butler himself would be the ideal candidate. Who better than the most decorated Marine in American history? Who better than someone veterans trust implicitly? Who better than a general with no political ambitions, no partisan affiliations, simply a patriot trying to save his country from Roosevelt's dangerous socialist experiment? Butler does not immediately refuse. This is important to understand. He does not throw Maguire out of his house. He does not call the police or report him to authorities. Instead, he continues to listen, asking questions, probing deeper. He wants to understand exactly who is behind this and how serious they are. He wants to know if this is one delusional bond salesman with fantasies of importance, or if this represents something much larger and much more dangerous. Maguire provides reassurance on both counts. He mentions backers, wealthy men, men with resources, men who understand that Roosevelt is destroying America and that drastic measures may be necessary. He never provides a complete list of names, but the implications are clear. This is not some fringe conspiracy. This involves people with real power and real money, people who can provide the funding necessary to organise such a massive movement. Butler asks specific questions. What about weapons? Maguire assures him that would not be a problem. Equipment can be acquired. Connections exist to military suppliers. Some veterans still have their service weapons. More can be obtained. Butler asks about public support. Maguire insists that millions of Americans are ready for change, that the New Deal is destroying individual liberty, that strong leadership is necessary to prevent complete economic collapse or communist revolution. He frames the coup not as overthrowing America, but as saving it. Butler asks about the military. What happens when regular army units are ordered to stop 500,000 veterans? Maguire seems confident this will not be a problem. Many officers, he suggests, are themselves unhappy with Roosevelt. The military may not interfere, and if they do, the presence of so many veterans makes violent suppression politically impossible. But Butler is not convinced. Or rather, he is convinced that something serious is being planned. But he is not convinced that it is right. He is not convinced that replacing democracy with dictatorship, even a supposedly benevolent one, is acceptable. He's not convinced that men who wear nice suits and speak about patriotism are actually patriots rather than oligarchs protecting their wealth. He continues meeting with Maguire throughout late 1933 and into early 1934, gathering information, learning more about the conspiracy. And all the while, a decision is forming in his mind about what he will do with this information. Maguire has no idea that every conversation is being remembered, every detail filed away, every name and connection noted. he believes he is successfully recruiting Butler. He believes the general's questions indicate interest rather than investigation. He is wrong. Butler is gathering evidence, building a case, preparing to do the one thing that will stop this plot before it can truly begin. He is preparing to expose it all. Chapter 4. Following the Money. If Gerald Maguire was simply a rogue bond salesman with delusions of grandeur and no real backing, Butler's story would be interesting but ultimately insignificant. A strange historical footnote about one man's fantasy taken too seriously. What makes the business plot compelling, what makes it genuinely disturbing, is the evidence that Maguire had access to substantial resources and connections to some of the most powerful interests in America. Let's follow the money. Maguire works for Grayson MP Murphy & Company, a Wall Street brokerage firm with deep connections to America's financial elite. Grayson Murphy himself is not just a businessman. He's a director of Guarantee Trust Company, which has close ties to J.P. Morgan. He's a director of Bethlehem Steel, one of the largest industrial corporations in America. He served as a military officer in World War I, giving him connections to the veteran community. He moves effortlessly between worlds of finance, industry, and military affairs. J.P. Morgan Jr., son of the legendary financier, runs one of the most powerful banking institutions in the world. The Morgan interests control or influence dozens of major corporations, railroads, utilities, and financial institutions. When Roosevelt implements banking reforms, when he pushes for greater regulation, when he supports higher taxes on the wealthy, the Morgan interests are among those most directly threatened. But the connections go deeper and become even more intriguing. In August 1934, just months before Butler testifies to Congress, a new organization forms called the American Liberty League. Its stated purpose is to oppose the New Deal and advocate for free enterprise and limited government. This sounds innocuous, like any number of political advocacy groups, but look at who funds it. The DuPont family contributes heavily. Pierre DuPont, Irénée DuPont, and Lambert DuPont are all involved. The DuPonts control DuPont Chemical, one of the largest corporations in America. They also control General Motors through extensive stock holdings. John Jacob Raskob joins as a major supporter. Raskob is a former chairman of General Motors and a former chairman of the Democratic National Committee, a man with connections spanning business and politics. Alfred Sloan, president of General Motors, becomes involved. Andrew Mellon, one of the wealthiest men in America and former Secretary of the Treasury, lends his name. Executives from Standard Oil, Goodyear Tire, and dozens of other major corporations join. These are not fringe figures. These are not minor businessmen angry about taxes. These are titans of American industry who collectively control a substantial portion of the American economy. The American Liberty League operates openly, publishing materials opposing the New Deal, lobbying against specific policies, giving speeches about the dangers of expanding government power. This is legal. This is protected speech. There is nothing inherently sinister about wealthy people advocating for their economic interests through legitimate political channels. But historians note the timing. The Liberty League forms right around the time Butler goes public with his allegations about a fascist plot. Its membership includes exactly the kind of corporate interests who would have been most threatened by Roosevelt's policies, and its rhetoric often echoes the themes Maguire allegedly discussed with Butler: that Roosevelt is destroying American freedom, that strong action may be necessary to save the country, that business interests must organize to protect themselves. Was the Liberty League connected to the plot Butler described? No direct evidence proves this, but the overlap is impossible to ignore. Butler's testimony includes other details that suggest serious backing beyond Maguire's personal resources. Maguire claimed to have travelled to Europe specifically to study fascist governments and how they organise paramilitary movements. Such a trip would require substantial funding and clear purpose. Business travellers don't casually spend months touring Italy and Germany studying political systems. Congressional investigators later confirmed that Maguire did indeed make these European trips. This is documented fact, not speculation. So he had access to money for extended international travel during the Depression, when most Americans could barely afford food. Maguire allegedly spoke to Butler about access to weapons and equipment for equipping hundreds of thousands of veterans. Either this was complete fabrication, or he had connections to military suppliers and confidence that funding would be available. He discussed specific plans for organising veteran groups, strategies for recruitment, logistics for moving masses of people to Washington. This level of detail suggests either serious planning or an impressively elaborate fantasy. The congressional committee that later investigated found Maguire's story partially corroborated. They confirmed he had made trips to Europe. They confirmed conversations between Maguire and Butler took place exactly as Butler described. They found evidence of discussions about organising veterans for political purposes. What they did not find, or at least did not make public, was direct documentation of funding sources or explicit approval from major corporate figures. No paper trail connected specific wealthy individuals to the plot. No document surfaced showing corporate board meetings where overthrowing the government was discussed. This is where the conspiracy deepens rather than dissolves, because the absence of evidence is not necessarily evidence of absence, especially when dealing with sophisticated people who understand how to insulate themselves from risk. Powerful people do not write memos about treason. They do not create paper trails connecting them to coup attempts. They use intermediaries, cutouts, people like Maguire who can make contact without revealing who is really behind the operation. If the plot succeeds, the real backers reveal themselves and reap the rewards. If it fails, the intermediary takes the fall while the masterminds remain untouchable. This is basic tradecraft for anyone engaged in illegal or politically dangerous activities. So the question is not whether there is explicit documentation connecting wealthy elites to the business plot. The question is whether the circumstantial evidence is strong enough to suggest their involvement, despite the lack of explicit proof. Gerald Maguire had European travel funding during the Depression. He had access to people with resources. He spoke confidently about acquiring weapons and equipment. He made specific references to wealthy backers. His employer was connected to the Morgan interests, and an organisation formed by many of the same interests he allegedly represented appeared right as the plot was being exposed. Butler would later say that he believed Maguire was a messenger for far more powerful figures, that the bond salesman was not the architect but merely the recruiter, that if he had agreed to the plan, the real players would have revealed themselves, providing the funding and support necessary to execute the operation. But Butler did not agree, and so the identities of those real players, if they existed beyond Maguire's imagination, remained hidden in the shadows where powerful people prefer to operate. Chapter 5. Congress investigates. On November 20th, 1934, the Special Committee on Un-American Activities, commonly known as the McCormick-Dickstein Committee, hears extraordinary testimony from Smedley Darlington Butler. The committee is chaired by Representatives John McCormick of Massachusetts and Samuel Dickstein of New York. It was originally formed to investigate Nazi propaganda activities in the United States, part of a growing concern about foreign influence in American politics. The timing is significant. Hitler has consolidated power in Germany. Fascist movements are growing across Europe, and American politicians are beginning to worry that similar ideologies might take root in the United States. Butler's allegations expand their mandate considerably. This is not about foreign propaganda. This is about domestic conspiracy. This is about American citizens, wealthy and powerful American citizens, allegedly plotting to overthrow the American government. The hearing room is not packed with reporters. This is not a public spectacle with cameras and dramatic confrontations. It is a relatively quiet congressional hearing, the kind that happens regularly in Washington, attended by committee members, a few staff members, and minimal press coverage. Butler speaks for hours. His testimony is methodical, detailed, and disturbing. He provides specific dates for his meetings with Maguire. He recounts conversations nearly word for word, the way someone with military training remembers briefings and debriefings. He describes how Maguire's approach evolved over months, from seemingly innocent discussions about veteran politics to explicit plans for marching on Washington and installing a dictator. He names names where he can. Gerald Maguire is identified explicitly. Grayson Murphy is mentioned as Maguire's employer, References are made to connections with Morgan banking interests and major corporations, though Butler is careful not to make accusations he cannot prove. He describes the European trip Maguire took to study fascist organising methods. He recounts Maguire's admiring descriptions of Mussolini's approach to governance. He explains the proposed structure: 500,000 veterans, a massive march, forcing Roosevelt into a figurehead role, installing Butler himself as Secretary of General Affairs. The committee is sceptical at first, as any reasonable people would be. The idea of wealthy American business leaders attempting to overthrow the government seems absurd. America is not some unstable Latin American republic prone to coups. This is the United States, with deep democratic traditions and institutional stability. But Butler's credibility is impeccable. He is not known for wild claims or attention-seeking behaviour. His military record is beyond reproach. He has nothing to gain from fabricating this story and much to lose. If he is lying, he is committing perjury before Congress, destroying his reputation and making himself look like a paranoid fool. And his testimony is specific enough to be verified or disproven. He provides dates, locations, names. If this is fabrication, investigators can prove it. If it is true, evidence will exist to corroborate it. So they investigate. Gerald Maguire is called to testify. He arrives looking nervous, which is understandable given that he has just been accused before Congress of planning treason. He denies Butler's allegations, claiming the general misunderstood their conversations. He admits to meeting with Butler multiple times, which establishes that contact occurred as Butler described. But he insists they discussed only conventional political organising, nothing treasonous, nothing resembling a coup attempt. He acknowledges travelling to Europe but says it was for business purposes unrelated to studying fascist governments. He admits connections to Wall Street and major corporations, but frames these as normal business relationships, not conspiracy. His testimony is careful. He does not directly call Butler a liar, which would be risky given Butler's reputation. Instead, he suggests misunderstanding, misinterpretation, conversations taken out of context. But there are problems with Maguire's denials. Investigators confirm details that corroborate Butler's version. They verify Maguire's European trips occurred when and where Butler said they did. They find evidence that Maguire did indeed have conversations about organising veterans for political purposes. They discover that Maguire had access to funding and connections that go beyond what a simple bond salesman would normally possess. Other witnesses are interviewed. Some corroborate parts of Butler's story. Paul Comley French, a journalist who accompanied Butler to one meeting with Maguire, testifies that Maguire did indeed discuss plans for a Veterans March on Washington. This is crucial. Butler is not the only person who heard these things. An independent witness confirms key elements of the story. The committee examines documents, travel records, financial transactions. They dig into Maguire's background, his connections, his activities in the months leading up to Butler's testimony. What emerges is a complicated picture. Clear evidence exists that Maguire approached Butler. Evidence confirms that Maguire had connections to wealthy interests opposed to Roosevelt. Evidence shows discussions about organising veterans took place. Evidence demonstrates Maguire travelled to Europe and studied fascist governments. But direct proof of a concrete operational plan to overthrow the government remains elusive. No written plans surface, no smoking gun documents appear, no major financiers step forward to admit involvement or testify about what they knew. This is where the investigation reaches its limits. Either the conspirators were sophisticated enough to avoid creating evidence, or the conspiracy was more talk than action. Wealthy men entertaining dangerous fantasies without committing to actual treason. In February 1935, the committee releases its report. The language is carefully worded but extremely significant for anyone who reads closely. In the last few weeks of the committee's official life, it received evidence showing that certain persons had made an attempt to establish a fascist organisation in this country. There is no question that these attempts were discussed, were planned, and might have been placed in execution when and if the financial backers deemed it expedient. Read that carefully. Read it again. The committee confirms that attempts were discussed. They confirm plans existed. They confirm these plans might have been placed in execution if financial backers chose to proceed. This is not a dismissal of Butler's claims as the ravings of a paranoid general. This is not a statement that nothing happened. This is an explicit confirmation that a fascist organisation was planned and could have been executed. Yet the report carefully avoids naming most of the people allegedly involved. References to certain persons and financial backers remain vague. The names of major corporate figures are largely omitted. The full extent of who was involved, how much money was available, how far planning had progressed, all of this remains obscured, and most remarkably, no criminal charges follow. No subpoenas are issued for the major business figures whose names appeared in testimony. No prosecutions occur. The Justice Department takes no action. The investigation simply ends. The committee disbands. The story fades. Why? Several theories exist. Some suggest Roosevelt decided that prosecuting wealthy business leaders during a depression would destabilize the economy further. Others argue that evidence was insufficient for convictions, that without documentation explicitly showing conspiracy to commit treason, criminal charges would fail. Still others believe that powerful interests had enough influence to ensure the matter was quietly buried, that threats were made, pressure was applied, and people with something to lose made sure the investigation went only so far and no further. What is undeniable is that Congress confirmed something serious happened, something that involved planning to establish a fascist organisation, something that might have been executed. And then Congress, the Justice Department, and the Roosevelt administration all decided to let it go. Butler continues speaking publicly about the plot, giving speeches, granting interviews. But media attention dwindles rapidly. He becomes, in many circles, dismissed as someone who perhaps exaggerated a minor incident into a major conspiracy. But the congressional record remains. The testimony is preserved. The committee's conclusion stands, recorded in official documents. Something was planned. Something serious. Something that came closer to happening than most Americans will ever realize. And the people responsible walked free. Chapter 6. The Media Silence. One of the most puzzling and revealing aspects of the business plot is how quickly it disappeared from public consciousness. A decorated general testifies under oath that wealthy interests tried to recruit him for a coup. Congress investigates and confirms that discussions about establishing a fascist organisation took place. Yet within weeks, the story is barely mentioned in major newspapers, and within months, it is almost completely forgotten. This is not how major political scandals normally work. When the Teapot Dome scandal broke in the 1920s, revealing corruption in the Harding administration, newspapers covered it for years. When organised crime figures made headlines, the stories ran for months. When labour disputes turned violent, front-page coverage continued until the situations resolved. But the business plot? After the initial reports when Butler first makes his allegations, coverage drops off dramatically. And the coverage that does exist is often dismissive or sceptical rather than investigative. Initial coverage exists. When Butler first makes his allegations public in November 1934, some newspapers report them. But the tone is revealing. Headlines suggest Butler might be confused or exaggerating. Editorial commentary questions whether a serious plot actually existed. Some papers treat it as a curiosity rather than a potential constitutional crisis. The New York Times, one of the most influential papers in the country, covers the story but treats it with clear skepticism. An early article describes Butler's claims, but focuses more on Maguire's denials than on the details of the alleged conspiracy. The tone implies that a decorated general has perhaps gotten some innocent conversations confused with something more sinister. Other major publications follow similar approaches. The Washington Post, Chicago Tribune, and Los Angeles Times all provide some coverage, but it is measured, cautious, skeptical. Butler's claims are presented as allegations from a controversial figure, rather than credible testimony from a highly decorated officer with no history of fabrication or attention-seeking. Compare this to how other political scandals of the era are covered, especially those involving far less serious allegations. Corruption stories receive extensive ongoing coverage. political controversies are dissected in detail, labour disputes and social movements get comprehensive analysis, but a potential coup attempt, that gets a few articles and then silence. When the Congressional Committee releases its findings in February 1935 confirming that planning occurred, you would expect major coverage. Congress has just officially stated that attempts to establish a fascist organisation were discussed and might have been executed. This should be headline news. Instead, the story receives minimal attention. Some papers report the committee's findings briefly. Others do not cover it at all. There is no sustained investigation by major newspapers. No reporters are assigned to dig deeper. No editorial boards demand answers about who was involved and how such planning could occur. The story simply fades. Butler later speaks openly about this media silence. He gives speeches where he explicitly accuses newspapers of suppressing the story. He suggests that powerful interests, the same interests allegedly behind the plot, used their influence to discourage coverage. He points out that many major publications have close ties to the business world through advertising revenue and ownership structures. Stories that implicate wealthy industrialists and bankers might threaten those relationships, and Butler is not wrong about these connections. Major newspapers in the 1930s are owned by wealthy individuals who often have business interests beyond journalism. Advertising revenue comes from corporations who would not appreciate negative coverage. Publishers socialise with the same business leaders who would have been threatened by Roosevelt's policies. There is also the question of what newspapers can prove independently. Butler's testimony is credible, but he is describing private conversations and meetings. Maguire denies the allegations. Other potential conspirators are never definitively identified in public reporting. Without documents showing explicit plans or multiple witnesses confirming every detail, newspapers may have felt the story was too risky to pursue aggressively, but the silence goes beyond simple editorial caution or the challenge of verification. Some reporters who try to follow the story encounter unusual roadblocks. Sources refuse to talk. Documents suddenly become unavailable. Phone calls are not returned. The investigation seems to dead end at every turn in ways that suggest active interference rather than lack of information. One particularly telling incident involves Paul Comley French, the journalist who accompanied Butler to one meeting with Maguire. French provides corroborating testimony to Congress, confirming that Maguire did indeed discuss plans for organising veterans and marching on Washington. French is a respected journalist with a reputation for accuracy, yet his attempts to get the story published in major outlets are repeatedly rejected. Editors tell him the story is too controversial, too difficult to verify, too risky to run without absolute proof. French ends up publishing in smaller, less prominent publications, where his reporting reaches a fraction of the audience it would have reached in major newspapers. This pattern repeats. Journalists who want to cover the story find limited outlets willing to publish. Editors who might normally pursue a scandal of this magnitude decide it is not worth the trouble. Publishers who could demand answers instead remain silent. By mid-1935, less than a year after Butler's initial testimony, the business plot has essentially vanished from mainstream discourse. Butler continues giving speeches to veteran groups and labour organisations. His book, War is a Racket, receives some attention for its critique of the military-industrial complex, but his allegations about the coup attempt are rarely mentioned, and when they are, it is often with an implicit suggestion that he might have exaggerated or misunderstood what happened. This media silence has consequences that echo through history. Because the story disappeared so quickly, entire generations of Americans grow up never hearing about it. History textbooks do not mention it. Teachers do not discuss it. The business plot becomes one of those obscure historical footnotes that only researchers and conspiracy theorists know about. Even today, if you ask random Americans if they have heard of the business plot, the vast majority will say no. If you ask if they know who Smedley Butler was, most will not recognise the name despite his being one of the most decorated Marines in American history. Conspiracy theorists point to this silence as evidence of a cover-up. If the plot was not serious, they argue, why suppress the story? If Butler's allegations were baseless, why not expose him as a fraud through aggressive investigation? The pattern of coverage, initial reports followed by rapid silence, looks suspiciously like coordinated suppression rather than natural editorial decisions. Skeptics counter that newspapers simply moved on to other news in an era of economic crisis and global instability. Roosevelt's New Deal programs provided ongoing stories. International developments in Europe and Asia dominated headlines. The business plot, lacking dramatic developments or clear villains, simply was not compelling enough to sustain coverage. But this explanation struggles to account for the pattern. Newspapers sustained coverage of far less consequential stories. The business plot involved allegations of an attempted coup, congressional confirmation that planning occurred, and implications reaching to the highest levels of American business. This is objectively a massive story. Yet, it disappeared. Whatever the true explanation, one fact is undeniable. A congressional committee confirmed that discussions about overthrowing the government took place, and America collectively chose to forget about it. The media played a central role in that forgetting, whether through deliberate suppression, editorial caution, or simply following the lead of powerful interests who wanted the story buried. And that silence itself tells us something important about power in America. Some stories get told, some stories get amplified, and some stories, particularly those that threaten the interests of the wealthy and powerful, simply disappear. Chapter 7. The Unanswered Questions. Decades after the business plot, with the benefit of historical documents, congressional records and scholarly research, fundamental questions remain unanswered. The basic facts are not in dispute. Maguire approached Butler, conversations occurred, Congress investigated and confirmed planning took place. But the deeper questions, the ones that would actually explain what happened, remain frustratingly open. First, why recruit Butler specifically? On the surface, this makes sense. Butler is famous. Veterans trust him. His military credentials are impeccable. If you want to organise veterans into a political force, Butler is an obvious choice to lead them. But look deeper. By 1933, Butler is increasingly vocal in his criticism of corporate power and military interventions on behalf of business interests. He's giving speeches attacking exactly the kind of people who allegedly wanted to recruit him. He's not subtle about this. He's not quietly, privately grumbling. He is publicly, loudly, declaring that American military operations serve Wall Street rather than American national interests. Would sophisticated conspirators really approach someone so vocally opposed to their worldview? It seems almost incomprehensibly stupid. Unless they believed Butler's criticism was performative rather than genuine, unless they thought Butler was positioning himself for political office and could be bought with the right offer, unless they fundamentally misread his character, or perhaps Butler was not the first choice. Perhaps others were approached and refused before Maguire contacted Butler. Perhaps several generals were tested to see who might be receptive. We know Maguire talked to Butler. We do not know who else might have been contacted. If the conspiracy was real and sophisticated, they would not have put all their hopes on one person. The question becomes even more intriguing when you consider timing. Why approach Butler in 1933, just months after Roosevelt takes office? Why not wait to see if opposition to the New Deal would grow naturally? Why move so quickly to such an extreme measure? The answer might be that the conspirators, if they existed, recognised a window of opportunity. The Depression had created conditions where dramatic action might be possible. Veterans were desperate and angry. Roosevelt's New Deal was controversial and threatening to established interests. Public faith in traditional institutions was shaken. If you're going to attempt a coup, early in a presidency during an economic crisis is strategically the right time. But it still required recruiting someone willing to betray their oath to the Constitution, and they chose someone who would ultimately expose them instead. Second, why did Maguire have access to funding and European contacts? This question cuts to the heart of whether the conspiracy was real or fantasy. Maguire is a bond salesman. He's not a major figure in banking or industry. He does not have personal wealth sufficient to fund an operation of the scale he described to Butler. Yet congressional investigators confirmed Maguire travelled to Europe, confirmed he visited Italy, France and Germany. Confirmed these trips occurred when Butler said they did. International travel in the 1930s during the Depression was expensive. It required substantial funding and clear purpose. Business travellers did not casually spend months touring Europe studying political systems. So where did Maguire get the money for these trips? Who funded them? Who benefited from his research into fascist organising methods? If Maguire was acting alone, if this was just his personal fantasy, the European trips make no sense. Why would a bond salesman spend significant money studying foreign governments? What would be the point? But if Maguire was acting as an agent for wealthier interests, if someone was backing his activities, the trips make perfect sense. You send someone to study how Mussolini organised his black shirts, how Hitler built the SA and SS, how fascist governments structure paramilitary forces and maintain control. You gather information about what works. Then you apply those lessons to the American context. Maguire spoke confidently to Butler about accessing weapons and equipment. He discussed organising hundreds of thousands of veterans. He referenced financial backers with resources. Either he was delusional and none of this was real, or someone was providing him with backing and assurances. The Congressional Committee did not, or could not, trace the money conclusively. But the fact that Maguire had resources beyond his personal means is not disputed. Someone enabled his activities. The question is who? Third, why did Congress confirm planning but pursue no charges? This is perhaps the most frustrating unanswered question. The committee's final report explicitly states that attempts to establish a fascist organisation were discussed, were planned, and might have been placed in execution if financial backers deemed it expedient. That language is not ambiguous. That is not a careful statement designed to neither confirm nor deny. That is an explicit confirmation that serious planning occurred, yet no prosecutions follow. No major figures are even publicly named in the official report. The Justice Department, which could have brought charges based on congressional findings, takes no action. The FBI, which could have investigated further, does not pursue the matter. Why? Several theories exist. Perhaps evidence was insufficient for criminal convictions. Conspiracy to commit treason requires proving intent and concrete actions toward execution. Conversations and planning, however serious, might not meet the legal threshold for prosecution. Maguire denied the allegations. Other potential conspirators were never definitively identified. Without explicit documentation or multiple witnesses, convictions might have been impossible to secure. Perhaps Roosevelt made a calculated political decision. Prosecuting wealthy business leaders during the Depression could have destabilized the economy further. It could have deepened the divide between business and government at a time when cooperation was needed. It might have created martyrs and sympathy for people Roosevelt wanted to marginalize politically. Better, perhaps, to expose the plot just enough to prevent it from proceeding, then let it fade rather than creating a sensational trial. Or perhaps more sinister forces were at work. Perhaps powerful interests exerted pressure. Perhaps threats were made, implicitly or explicitly. Perhaps evidence disappeared. Perhaps witnesses were discouraged from cooperating. Perhaps the investigation was allowed to proceed only so far before being quietly shut down to protect people who could not be touched. We do not know. The reasoning behind the decision not to prosecute was never publicly explained. We have the committee's conclusion, but not their rationale for what did not happen next. Fourth, why were names shielded? Congressional committees usually name names. Investigations into corruption, propaganda, and criminal activity typically identify perpetrators explicitly. When Congress investigates corporate wrongdoing or political corruption, they name the corporations and the individuals involved. The business plot investigation does not follow this pattern. The final report refers to certain persons and financial backers without providing specifics. Butler names Gerald Maguire and references connections to Wall Street interests and major corporations. But the official report omits most names. This could be standard procedure when evidence is circumstantial. Naming someone without proof sufficient for conviction opens the committee to libel concerns and political retaliation. Perhaps the committee felt they had enough evidence to confirm planning occurred, but not enough to name specific backers without risking legal consequences. Or perhaps names were shielded deliberately to protect powerful figures. Perhaps committee members received pressure from people with influence. Perhaps deals were made. Confirm the basic facts, but do not name names, and in return certain political considerations will be arranged. The selective disclosure pattern, confirming a conspiracy existed while obscuring who was responsible, is consistent with protecting the powerful while appearing to take the allegations seriously. Fifth, how serious was the plan? Butler describes detailed conversations about recruiting veterans, marching on Washington, and installing a Secretary of General Affairs to effectively replace Roosevelt. Maguire allegedly discusses logistics, funding, and European precedents. Congressional investigators confirm that planning occurred. But was this ever operationally viable? Could 500,000 veterans actually be recruited? Would they truly march on Washington at Butler's command? Would the military stand aside? Would the public accept it? Would Roosevelt simply resign under pressure? Skeptics argue the plan was absurd from the start. The logistics alone would be overwhelming, the political obstacles insurmountable, the risk of failure catastrophic. Even if some wealthy figures entertained the idea, even if Maguire was genuinely trying to recruit Butler, the conspiracy could never have succeeded. But this analysis assumes rational calculation. The 1930s were not a rational time. Fascist coups were succeeding across Europe in countries with stronger democratic traditions than many people realised. Mussolini took power in Italy, a country with a constitutional monarchy and parliamentary system. Hitler was elected and then dismantled democratic institutions in Germany, a modern industrial nation with sophisticated civil society. If it could happen there, why not America? Veterans were desperate. The economy was devastated. Faith in democratic institutions was weakened. Roosevelt was implementing policies that terrified the wealthy elite. The conditions for authoritarian movements were present, and Butler himself took it seriously. He did not dismiss Maguire as delusional. He did not laugh off the approach. He gathered information, reported it to Congress, and testified under oath that he believed a genuine attempt to overthrow the government was being planned. Butler spent his entire adult life in military service. He understood operational planning. He knew the difference between fantasy and feasible operations, and he concluded this was the latter. Whether the plot would have succeeded if Butler had agreed remains speculation. But the fact that a decorated general believed it was serious enough to expose tells us it was not merely theoretical discussion over drinks at a club. Chapter 8. What conspiracy researchers believe. In the decades since the business plot, researchers operating outside mainstream academic history have developed extensive theories about what really happened. It is important to distinguish these interpretations from established documented facts, but it is equally important to understand why these theories persist and what they suggest about hidden power structures in America. Mainstream academic history generally treats the business plot as an interesting but ultimately minor episode, something that was discussed, something that revealed anxiety among elites about the New Deal, but nothing that ever came close to succeeding. A curiosity rather than a crisis. Conspiracy researchers see something much darker, and their interpretation deserves serious consideration because it explains patterns that mainstream history struggles to account for. Their reading goes something like this. In 1933, a group of powerful industrialists and bankers recognized that Roosevelt's New Deal posed an existential threat to their wealth and power. They looked at fascist governments in Europe and saw a model that preserved corporate interests while crushing labour movements and socialist organising. They decided that America needed similar leadership. These men were not fringe extremists. They were pillars of American business. They controlled banks, corporations, manufacturing. They had access to resources that most people cannot even conceptualize. And they were genuinely terrified that Roosevelt was implementing socialism that would destroy everything they had built. They began planning a coup, not a violent revolution with tanks in the streets. That would be too risky, too likely to backfire. Something more subtle and more brilliant. a massive demonstration of veteran support that would intimidate Roosevelt into accepting a power-sharing arrangement. Present it as saving America rather than overthrowing democracy. Frame it as patriots preventing socialist destruction rather than corporate interests protecting profits. The genius of the plan, if it existed, was its potential legitimacy. If you can get the most decorated general in American history to lead 500,000 veterans to Washington, if they claim to be saving the Constitution from Roosevelt's violations, if they present themselves as patriots rather than traitors, you might actually succeed. The optics would be powerful, the implicit threat would be overwhelming, and Roosevelt might calculate that resistance would cause civil war. They needed a leader credible enough to command veteran loyalty. They chose Butler, not realizing his criticisms of corporate power were genuine rather than political positioning. They approached him carefully, testing his receptiveness through increasingly explicit conversations. Maguire was not the architect. He was a recruiter, someone expendable if things went wrong. The real backers remained hidden, insulated by layers of deniability. If Butler had agreed, they would have revealed themselves, providing the funding and support necessary to execute the operation. If he refused, Maguire would take any fallout while the real conspirators remained untouchable. Butler recognised what was happening and made a calculated decision. He would continue meeting with Maguire, gathering information, learning as much as possible about the conspiracy. Then he would expose it in a way that made execution impossible. His testimony to Congress served multiple purposes. It revealed the plot, making it impossible to proceed. It created a historical record that could not be completely erased. It warned America about the danger of corporate fascism, and it forced the conspirators to retreat and abandon their plans. Congress confirmed the plot was real, but declined to prosecute because naming the conspirators would reveal just how high the corruption reached. Imagine the testimony in a trial. Imagine major corporate executives being questioned under oath about planning to overthrow the government. Imagine the destabilization of business confidence during the Depression. Imagine the political crisis if America's wealthiest families were exposed as attempted coup plotters. Roosevelt made a pragmatic decision. Expose the plot enough to prevent execution, but do not push for prosecutions that would tear the country apart. Let the warning stand. Let the conspirators know they were caught. But do not create the spectacle of a trial that would dominate headlines for years. So the story was buried. Media coverage was suppressed through a combination of ownership interests, advertising pressure, and direct intervention. Butler became marginalised as a controversial figure whose allegations might have been exaggerated, and America forgot how close it came to authoritarianism. This narrative is compelling. It explains the unanswered questions. It accounts for the media silence. It makes sense of why Congress confirmed planning but pursued no charges. It presents Butler as a hero who saved democracy at personal cost. But is it true? Academic historians remain sceptical. They point out the lack of direct evidence linking specific wealthy individuals to explicit coup planning. They note that Maguire's conversations with Butler, while suspicious, do not prove a concrete operational plan with funding committed and timelines established. They observe that organising 500,000 veterans would require logistics that no evidence suggests existed. They propose alternative explanations. Perhaps Maguire was exploring ideas on behalf of business interests, testing whether such a plan was feasible, but never received authorization to actually proceed. Perhaps wealthy elites entertained dangerous fantasies about removing Roosevelt without ever committing to action. Perhaps Butler misinterpreted conversations or Maguire exaggerated his connections to seem more important. The truth likely falls somewhere between complete conspiracy and complete dismissal. Something real was happening. Maguire was not acting in total isolation. Powerful interests opposed to Roosevelt were exploring options, perhaps more seriously than they would later admit. Whether those explorations constituted an operational coup attempt or merely dangerous speculation remains genuinely uncertain. But consider what we know for absolute certain. Butler believed he was being recruited for a coup. He took the threat seriously enough to testify under oath before Congress. Congress investigated and confirmed that attempts to establish a fascist organisation were discussed, were planned, and might have been executed if backers chose to proceed. That confirmation from Congress is not speculation. That is official documented fact in the congressional record. Something serious enough to generate that statement from a congressional committee investigating un-American activities actually happened. The conspiracy researcher interpretation might not be entirely correct in every detail, but it is not baseless paranoia. It is built on documented facts that mainstream history struggles to explain. The European trips, the conversations, the congressional confirmation, the lack of prosecutions, the media silence. Whether you call it a conspiracy or a near miss, whether you believe it was fully operational or merely exploratory, one thing is undeniable. American democracy faced a threat from within, from people with power and resources, and only Butler's refusal prevented us from discovering how serious that threat truly was. Chapter 9. America's Forgotten Warning. No coup occurred. No government fell. Franklin Roosevelt completed his first term and was elected 3 more times, serving longer than any president in American history. The wealthy interests that opposed him adapted, finding other ways to exercise influence through lobbying, propaganda, and political opposition. American democracy survived. So why does the business plot matter almost 90 years later? Because a decorated general went to Congress and said, "This was real." And Congress responded, "It was discussed, it was planned, and it might have happened." That exchange represents one of the most remarkable and troubling moments in American history. A moment when the unthinkable was considered by people with power. A moment when the mechanisms of a coup were explored in detail. A moment when America came closer to authoritarianism than most people will ever realise. Butler's warning was not just about a specific plot by specific people. It was about something deeper and more enduring. The danger of concentrated wealth, the threat of corporate power to democratic institutions, how economic crisis creates opportunities for authoritarian solutions, and how quickly democracy can be threatened when enough powerful people decide it no longer serves their interests. In his later speeches and writings, Butler emphasized these systemic themes. He described in detail how business interests shape military policy, how wars are fought to benefit corporations while ordinary soldiers die, how the machinery of government serves wealth rather than citizens. His book, War is a Racket, published in 1935, remains one of the most powerful critiques of militarism ever written by an American military officer. In it, he calculates profits made by corporations during World War I while soldiers died in trenches. He lists companies that made fortunes from military contracts. He proposes radical reforms, including that only soldiers who will actually fight should be allowed to vote on whether to go to war. It is devastating, angry, and written by someone who spent 33 years serving the system he is now exposing. But beyond his anti-war message, Butler's testimony about the business plot carried a different warning that is even more relevant today. Democracy is fragile. It is not guaranteed by documents or traditions. It survives only when people actively defend it. When enough powerful people feel threatened by democratic decisions, they will seek alternatives. And if those alternatives involve military force, the presence of trained personnel and sympathetic officers can make the unthinkable possible. This warning echoes through history with disturbing consistency. Coups have succeeded in other democracies. Business interests have overthrown governments in other countries, often with American support. Chile in 1973, when a democratically elected socialist president was overthrown and replaced with a military dictatorship backed by corporate interests. Iran in 1953, when a democratically elected leader who nationalised oil was removed in a coup orchestrated by American and British intelligence at the behest of oil companies. America's immunity to such forces is not guaranteed by virtue of being America. It is guaranteed only by vigilance, by the willingness of people in positions of power to choose principle over profit, democracy over dictatorship. The business plot failed because Butler exposed it. But consider the counterfactual. What if Butler had agreed? What if he had believed Maguire's arguments about saving America from Roosevelt's socialism? What if he had been more concerned about communist revolution than corporate coup? What if he had led those veterans to Washington? Would the military have fired on American veterans led by the most decorated Marine in history? Would Roosevelt have capitulated rather than risk civil war? Would the American people have accepted it as necessary to save the country from radical change? Would history record it as a legitimate correction to government overreach rather than a coup? We cannot know. History does not reveal its alternative paths. But the fact that we can ask these questions, that a scenario existed where a different decision by one man might have fundamentally altered American government, should be sobering. What we know is that democracy survived, that Butler chose transparency over conspiracy, that Congress confirmed his story even if they took no further action, that America, at least this once, stepped back from the edge. But the edge was there, the possibility existed, and the fact that this moment has been largely forgotten is itself a kind of failure. Collective amnesia about threats to democracy makes those threats more likely to recur. Butler died in June 1940 of cancer at age 58. He died before America entered World War II, before his warnings about war profiteering would be forgotten in patriotic fervour. His testimony about the business plot had already faded from public memory. Today, most Americans have never heard of Smedley Butler. History classes rarely mention him beyond perhaps a footnote in discussions of American imperialism. The business plot is unknown to the vast majority of citizens. It is a curiosity for researchers, a conspiracy theory for some, a forgotten footnote for most. Yet his story deserves to be remembered and taught and discussed, not because it proves some grand conspiracy that controls all aspects of American government, not because it validates paranoid beliefs about shadowy cabals running the world, but because it reveals a profound truth about power. When those who have it feel threatened, they will consider options that seem unthinkable in calmer times. Butler saw such an option being considered. He was offered a role in executing it, and he chose to speak rather than participate. In doing so, he may have prevented one of the greatest crises in American history. The story also reveals how power protects itself. No prosecutions, names shielded, media silence, the story buried. The lesson is clear. You can plan a coup in America and walk free as long as you're wealthy enough and connected enough, and the plan never quite reaches execution. That lesson should disturb us. It should make us question. It should make us vigilant. Because the conditions that made the business plot possible, that made powerful people consider overthrowing democracy, those conditions recur throughout history. Economic crisis, political polarization, fear of change, powerful interests threatened by reform. These conditions exist now. They will exist in the future. And each time they exist, someone will consider whether democracy is worth preserving, or whether authoritarian solutions would better serve their interests. Butler's choice to expose rather than execute reminds us that individuals matter, that conscience matters, that when confronted with offers of power in exchange for betraying principles, how we respond shapes history. Final question. So what was the business plot? Was it a genuine coup attempt by America's wealthiest men, a fully operational plan with funding and logistics in place that failed only because Butler exposed it? Was it exploratory conversations that never approached actual implementation? Wealthy men entertaining dangerous fantasies but never seriously committing to action? Or was it something in between, a conspiracy that existed in potential, that could have become real if circumstances aligned, and Butler had agreed, that died because one man chose democracy over dictatorship? The evidence supports all three interpretations to varying degrees. Congressional testimony confirms discussions occurred. Logic suggests operational realities would have made execution difficult. The absence of prosecutions indicates either insufficient evidence or protection of powerful interests. What cannot be debated is this. In 1934, people with resources and connections discussed overthrowing the American government. They identified a military leader to recruit. They explored logistics and funding. They studied European fascist movements for organisational models. And they came close enough to implementation that a congressional committee investigated, confirmed planning occurred, and stated explicitly that execution might have followed if financial backers deemed it expedient. That alone makes the business plot one of the most significant forgotten moments in American history, not because it succeeded, because it was attempted, because it came close enough to make a decorated general risk his reputation to expose it, because Congress confirmed it happened and then America collectively chose to forget, and because it reminds us that democracy's survival is never inevitable. It requires people who choose principle over power. It requires transparency over conspiracy. It requires recognition that some offers, no matter how they are presented, no matter what justifications are provided, must be refused. Smedley Darlington Butler was offered a chance to become the most powerful man in America. He was promised the loyalty of hundreds of thousands of veterans. He was told he would be saving the country from disaster, protecting the Constitution from socialist overreach, preventing communist revolution. He said no. He said no. And then he exposed what was being planned, knowing it would make him enemies among the most powerful people in America. Knowing it might cost him his reputation. Knowing mainstream media might dismiss him. Knowing history might forget him. He said no because he understood something that the conspirators did not. That betraying democracy, even to supposedly save it, is still betrayal. That some principles cannot be compromised regardless of justification. That oath to the Constitution means something more important than personal power or financial reward. And perhaps that simple refusal, that choice to speak rather than participate, is the most important part of the story. Not the conspiracy itself, but the fact that when confronted with it, one man chose not to participate, chose to risk everything to expose it, chose country over personal advancement. History is shaped by such choices more than we realise. Great forces and economic conditions and social movements all matter, but so do individual decisions at critical moments. Butler's decision to expose the business plot rather than lead it represents one of those critical moments. The business plot failed because Butler made the right choice. The question for every generation is whether, when faced with similar choices, when offered power in exchange for principles, when told that betraying democracy is actually saving it, we will do the same. Will we recognise the offer for what it is? Will we have the courage to refuse? Will we risk reputation and comfort to expose conspiracies against democracy? Or will we rationalise, justify, convince ourselves that this time is different, that extraordinary circumstances require extraordinary measures, that the ends justify the means? Butler chose. He chose well. And democracy survived. That is the warning he left us. That is the lesson we forgot. That is the story that needs to be remembered. Make sure to leave your video ideas in the comments below. The encrypted file arrived at 3:47 a.m. on a Tuesday, but would later be erased from official records. Rebecca Martinez didn't hear the notification. She was already awake, staring at the ceiling of her Brussels apartment, unable to shake the feeling that someone had been watching her building for the past 3 nights. The paranoia was new, the insomnia wasn't. When you spent 15 years documenting suppressed historical records for the International Archives Initiative, sleep became a luxury reserved for people who didn't know what they knew. Her phone buzzed again, then again. She rolled over, squinting at the screen. 23 messages, all from the same encrypted number, all sent within the last 90 seconds. The final message was simple. Open the packet, then run. Victor. Rebecca's hands trembled as she sat up. Victor Molnar, Hungarian intelligence defector. She'd met him exactly once 6 months ago at a cafe in Vienna, where he'd passed her a napkin with a single word written in barely visible pencil. Seraphim. She'd researched the term obsessively after that meeting, found nothing conclusive. Historical references to angels, to divine beings, to mythological guardians. Nothing that explained why a career intelligence officer would risk his life to whisper it to her. Now he was telling her to run. Rebecca pulled on jeans and a sweater, her heart hammering. The packet sat on her kitchen counter, where the courier had left it the previous evening. Plain manila envelope, no return address. She'd been too exhausted to open it, planning to examine it properly in the morning with coffee and her recording equipment. She didn't have that luxury anymore. Inside the envelope was a USB drive and a single sheet of aged paper, protected by archival plastic. The document appeared to be a photocopy of a diplomatic memorandum, dated 1952, bearing the seal of the Belgian royal household. Most of it was in French, but one phrase had been highlighted in yellow, the ink faded but still legible. Préserver la lignée des Séraphins à tout prix. Preserve the Seraphim bloodline at all costs. Beneath it, in Victor's handwriting, it was never about religion, it was about species. Rebecca heard footsteps in the hallway outside her apartment. Slow, deliberate, stopping directly in front of her door. She grabbed her laptop bag, shoved the USB drive into her pocket, and went out the window. The train to Amsterdam gave Rebecca 4 hours to examine the contents of Victor's USB drive, without worrying about being cornered in a confined space. She'd chosen a middle car, positioned herself where she could watch both entrances, and created 3 separate cloud backups before the train even left Brussels. The drive contained 47 files, medical records, genetic sequencing reports, internal memos from private genetics companies spanning 2 decades, and one 70-page white paper that made her hands shake so badly she had to set down her coffee. The title page read, S-Helix Variant Analysis, Preliminary Findings and Containment Protocol, authored by Helix Genomics SA, Zurich. Date, September 2019. Classification, Internal Review Only. Rebecca began reading. The document described a genetic anomaly first identified in 2003 during routine ancestry testing conducted by a California-based consumer genetics company. A wealthy client, name redacted, had submitted their DNA for analysis and received results that triggered automatic flagging within the company's quality control systems. The anomaly wasn't a mutation. It was a structural variant in what geneticists typically classified as junk DNA, the 98% of the human genome that doesn't code for proteins. Except this particular sequence wasn't junk. It was organised, intentional, and it appeared in exactly the same location across multiple unrelated individuals who submitted samples over the following months. By 2008, private genetics companies had identified the variant in 14 distinct family lineages, some European aristocracy, some Middle Eastern royal families, a handful embedded in American banking dynasties and political families. The pattern was impossible to ignore. They called it the S-Helix variant. Publicly, it was dismissed as a benign evolutionary remnant, a footnote in genetic diversity studies. But the internal communications told a different story. Rebecca scrolled through email chains between geneticists who'd stumbled onto the variant. The earliest exchanges were cautious, professional, scientists sharing anomalous data, requesting peer review. But as months turned into years, the tone shifted. Confusion gave way to concern. Concern gave way to something that looked a lot like fear. One email from 2006, sent by a lead researcher at the California company to her supervisor. I've been running the S-helix sequence through every comparative analysis tool we have. It doesn't match any known primate DNA. I expanded the search to all mammalian genomes in our database. Nothing. I even ran it against our limited reptilian and avian samples. The structure is completely novel. But here's what's keeping me up at night. It's not random. Random junk DNA has statistical markers we can identify. This sequence has intentional structure. It's like finding a paragraph of Shakespeare in the middle of random letter sequences. Someone wrote this, something wrote this, and it's sitting in the genome of some of the most powerful families in the world. The supervisor's response had been brief. Delete this email. We'll discuss in person. But the emails continued, routed through personal accounts, encrypted services, back channels. Rebecca found a thread from 2009 where 3 geneticists from different companies, competitors technically, were sharing data in secret. I've confirmed the variant in 7 of my flagged samples, one wrote, all from families with documented lineages going back at least 5 centuries. Old money, old power. This isn't random distribution. Same here, another replied. But here's what I can't explain. Why is it only expressing in some family members? I've got siblings where one carries active S-helix and the other shows no trace. It's not following Mendelian inheritance patterns. The third geneticist's response was the most unsettling. Because it's not being inherited. It's being activated. I think we're looking at dormant code that switches on under specific conditions. Like a program waiting for the right input. Rebecca sat back, watching Belgian countryside blur into Dutch flatlands through the train window. Dormant code, waiting for input. She kept reading. One memo, dated March 2011, from the Chief Science Officer of Helix Genomics to an unnamed recipient. We've run the S-helix through every comparative database available. Primate, mammalian, vertebrate. The sequence doesn't match anything in the known biological record. More concerning, when exposed to specific electromagnetic frequencies in laboratory conditions, the variant exhibits responsive behaviour. It's not just sitting there, it's listening. Rebecca read the sentence 3 times. It's listening. The memo continued with technical details that made her head spin, frequency ranges, resonance patterns. But the conclusion was clear. When synthetic S-helix sequences were exposed to electromagnetic radiation in specific frequency bands, particularly those used in cellular communications and Wi-Fi networks, the DNA structure changed configuration. Not degraded, changed, unfolded, like it was receiving a signal. Another memo from 2015 referenced a consultation with a retired geneticist named Emil Voss, formerly of the Max Planck Institute. His assessment had been suppressed within hours of submission. The S-helix is not random genetic drift. It's architecture. Whoever designed it understood genetics at a level we're only beginning to approach. This isn't human DNA contamination. This isn't viral integration. This is something else. Something not entirely human, but not random. I've spent 40 years studying genetic mutations and evolutionary biology. Nothing in my experience prepared me for this. The S-helix isn't evolving toward anything. It's already complete. It's been complete for thousands of years, just waiting. The question isn't what it is. The question is what happens when it fully activates. The white paper included appendices with case studies. Rebecca read through them with growing unease. Case study A7. Female, age 34, investment banker, New York. Submitted DNA for ancestry testing in 2014. S-helix variant confirmed. Follow-up interview, conducted under guise of routine customer service. revealed subject had recently begun experiencing unusual clarity in pattern recognition. Subject reported ability to see market trends before they manifested in data. Subject attributed this to years of experience. Genetic counselling recommended. Subject declined further contact. Case study: B12, male, age 41, mid-level diplomat, Brussels. S-helix variant confirmed during routine security clearance medical screening. Subject demonstrated abnormal stress response during psychological evaluation, decreased cortisol under pressure, enhanced cognitive function during crisis simulation. When asked about this, subject stated, "I've always been good in emergencies. It's like everything slows down and becomes clear." Subject showed no awareness of physiological abnormality. Case study C3, female, age 28, software engineer, Silicon Valley. S-helix variant confirmed. Subject sought genetic testing after experiencing what she described as feeling like I'm interfacing with code instead of reading it. Neurological evaluation showed unusual synchronization between visual cortex and pattern recognition centers. Subject was developing AI algorithms with efficiency that puzzled her supervisors. "It's not that I'm smarter," subject reported. "It's that I can see how the systems want to organize themselves." Case after case. People living normal lives, excelling in their fields, unaware that their DNA contained something impossible. The white paper concluded with a recommendation that made Rebecca's stomach turn. Given the potential implications for global security and social stability, we recommend indefinite classification of S-helix findings under existing national security protocols. Public disclosure could trigger widespread panic and destabilization of affected family structures, many of whom occupy positions of significant political and economic influence. Furthermore, preliminary psychological assessments suggest that informing S-helix carriers of their genetic status may trigger latent activation events. Recommend strict information containment and monitoring protocols. Translation: don't tell anyone, don't ask questions, pretend it doesn't exist, and whatever you do, don't tell the people who carry it. Rebecca leaned back in her seat, processing what she'd read. 14 bloodlines, positions of influence, a genetic marker that responded to electromagnetic signals. People who were getting better at their jobs, better at seeing patterns, at handling stress, at interfacing with complex systems without understanding why. She pulled up her research notes on Victor's original message. Seraphim. She'd found references in ancient texts, beings described as divine messengers, often depicted with multiple wings and eyes of fire. But she dismissed it as metaphor, religious symbolism. What if it wasn't? What if the ancient texts were describing real beings? Not supernatural entities, but a different species, or a hybrid species, that had walked the earth and interbred with humans. What if their descendants were still here? Her phone buzzed. Unknown. Number. The message was brief. Victor is dead. You have what he died for. Use it. They're already watching you. Rebecca looked up sharply, scanning the train car. Business travellers, students, an elderly couple sharing a thermos of coffee. No one paying attention to her, but the message felt like ice water in her veins. The train suddenly felt very small. She went back to the files, pulling up a document she'd initially skipped over because it seemed like a bureaucratic personnel memo. Now she read it carefully. It was from Helix Genomics, dated 2018. A termination letter for one of the geneticists who'd been sharing information in those encrypted email chains. Effective immediately, your employment with Helix Genomics SA is terminated. Severance package and confidentiality agreement enclosed. Failure to comply with NDA terms will result in immediate legal action and potential criminal prosecution under Swiss national security statutes. All research materials, including personal notes and communications, are property of Helix Genomics and must be surrendered. Rebecca cross-referenced the name. Thomas Brenner, the geneticist who'd written, "It's like finding a paragraph of Shakespeare in random letter sequences." She searched for his name online, found an obituary from 2019, Heart attack at age 43, no prior history of cardiac issues. She searched for the other two geneticists from that email thread. One had died in a car accident in 2017. Single vehicle collision, no witnesses. The other had simply disappeared in 2020, left for a conference in Singapore, never arrived, never seen again. 3 scientists who'd shared information about the S-helix variant, all dead or missing within 4 years. Rebecca looked at Victor's message again, then run. She was beginning to understand why. Rebecca spent 3 days in Amsterdam, moving between internet cafes and using burner devices to research without leaving a digital trail. She needed to understand the historical context. If the seraphim were real, if they'd existed in some form throughout human history, there would be evidence, fragments, patterns. She started with Mesopotamia, in the cradle of civilization where writing itself was born. The earliest references appeared in pre-Sumerian archaeological fragments recovered from sites in modern-day Iraq and Syria. Most were heavily damaged, but one partially intact tablet from approximately 4000 BCE contained a passage that had puzzled archaeologists for decades. Rebecca found it in a digitised archive from the British Museum, catalogued but not widely published. The translation had been completed in 1952 by a scholar who'd later withdrawn from academic life entirely. His notes, attached to the file, were illuminating. This text does not fit established Sumerian mythology. It predates the pantheon we associate with later Mesopotamian culture. The language is Proto-Sumerian, possibly older. What disturbs me most is the specificity. This is not myth. This reads like a historical account. The tablet itself, what remained of it. In the time before the great cities, the seraphim ruled from the mountain places. They were flesh-born, not spirit-born, and their skin gleamed like beaten gold when seen in the light of the horizon sun. They taught the people to mark the stars and to divide the year. They showed the way of numbers and the growing of grain. They took mates from among the people, but only those of certain blood. Their children were mighty, and their children's children built the first walls. The seraphim knew what was coming. They prepared chambers beneath the mountains. They said, "We go down into the deep earth, but our blood remains in you." When the sky speaks with lightning that is not lightning, when your children build towers that think, then our children's children will remember what they are. Their rule was law, until the fire came from the sky and the earth shook. The seraphim went beneath. Some of the people went with them. Most stayed above. The seraphim said, "We do not die, we wait. Keep the blood pure. When we wake, you will wake." Rebecca read it 3 times, each reading making her hands shake more. When your children build towers that think. That was written 4,000 years before computers existed. She found corroborating references in fragments from other ancient cultures, each adding pieces to the same impossible story. The Nag Hammadi Library, a collection of early Christian and Gnostic texts discovered in Egypt in 1945, contained multiple references to beings called Watchers, or Seraphim, who descended to earth and took human wives, producing offspring. But the Gnostic texts added details that mainstream religious scholarship often glossed over. Rebecca found a passage in the secret book of John that had been partially censored in most published translations. The Watchers were not of heaven, though they came from above the mountains. They were not spirit, though they lived longer than the generations of men. They were flesh, but flesh unlike ours. They saw what humanity would become and planted themselves in our lineage, so that when the time of great change arrived, some among us would be prepared for transformation. They did not come to judge or to save. They came to ensure the seed would survive what was coming. They mixed their essence with clay, and from this came those who could walk between worlds. These children appeared human, but carried within them the potential for something more. Egyptian records told similar stories, but with different emphasis. Rebecca found references in a doctoral thesis about the priest dynasties along the Nile that had never been widely distributed. The scholar had translated hieroglyphics from a tomb in Saqqara, dated to the early dynastic period around 3000 BCE. The Neteru came from the place where the 2 rivers meet the mountains. They were not gods, but the children of gods, and they taught the kingmakers how to preserve the divine blood through the generations. The Neteru could see in darkness. Their eyes reflected copper in lamplight. Their skin in certain seasons showed patterns like serpent scales beneath. They took only those of pure lineage as consorts. When the great death came from the sky, the Neteru went into the hidden places. They said, "Your children will not remember us as we are. They will make us into stories and paintings. This is as it should be, but some will carry our seed forward, sleeping in their flesh until the world is ready." The scholar's footnote on this passage was chilling. Note: the hieroglyphic for Neteru in this context does not match standard divine terminology. It appears to be a specific designation for a separate category of being. The literal translation might be closer to those who transform, or those who are both. The text is very clear. These are not supernatural entities, but physical beings with unusual biological characteristics. Rebecca found similar patterns in Sumerian king lists, ancient Hebrew texts, and even fragments from the Indus Valley civilization. Always the same core elements: beings who looked almost human, who lived among humans, who interbred with select human lineages, who enforced strict rules about bloodline purity, who possessed biological traits that set them apart: reflective eyes, unusual skin, enhanced abilities, and always the same instruction: the blood must not be diluted. She found the most explicit reference in a section of the Book of Enoch that had been removed from most canonical versions but survived in Ethiopian Orthodox tradition. This version included chapters that Western churches had deemed too problematic to include. Chapter 72, verses 14 to 19, "And the watchers made a covenant among themselves, saying, Let us preserve the blood without dilution, for the day of awakening approaches, and our children's children must be ready to receive what we have planted within them." They chose their mates with great care, testing bloodlines across generations. Those families they blessed with their seed, they also blessed with knowledge, how to maintain power across time, how to build systems that endure beyond single lives, how to recognize others of the hidden bloodline. And they said, "When the world fills with invisible fire, when the air itself carries thought, and the machines of men begin to wake, then our children will begin to remember. They will not know why they are different, only that they are. They will rise to positions of influence without understanding it is their nature to rule, and when enough of them have awakened, we will emerge from the places we have slept, and the separation between our kind and yours will end." This is not conquest. This is transformation. You're becoming what we always were. Rebecca sat back from the computer screen in the Amsterdam cafe, where she'd been working for 6 hours straight. Her coffee had gone, cold long ago. The sun had set outside without her noticing. The pattern was undeniable. Across thousands of years, across completely separate cultures that had no known contact with each other, the same story emerged. Non-human or partly human beings had interbred with select human populations. They'd done so systematically, carefully, maintaining bloodline purity across generations. They'd taught these families how to maintain power and influence, and they'd promised, or prophesied, that when humanity reached a certain level of technological development, the dormant genetic material they'd planted would activate. Their descendants would begin to wake up. Rebecca thought about the S-helix variant, the genetic marker that responded to electromagnetic frequencies, the marker that was appearing in families with documented lineages going back centuries, the marker that was activating more frequently as technology advanced, when the air itself carries thought. Wi-Fi, cellular networks, the invisible electromagnetic ocean that humanity had created in just the last few decades. When the machines of men begin to wake, artificial intelligence, neural networks, systems that learned and adapted and showed signs of genuine emergent behaviour. The ancient texts weren't prophecy, they were prediction, instructions left by beings who understood how human civilization would develop, because they designed it to develop that way. Her phone buzzed. A new email from an address she didn't recognise, archival.ghostprotocol.proton.me. The subject line: "You're looking in the right places, but you're missing the modern confirmation." The email contained a single attachment, a scanned page from what appeared to be a 1987 medical document, bearing the letterhead of a European royal family she immediately recognised. The header read, "Annual Haematological Assessment, Type S Classification." Rebecca downloaded the file, her hands shaking. The Ghost Protocol had found her, and they were feeding her exactly what she needed to know. The question was why. The 1987 document was clinically detailed and utterly damning. It described routine medical screening conducted on members of a specific aristocratic bloodline, names redacted throughout, but the family crest visible in the top corner made their identity unmistakable to anyone familiar with European monarchy. The assessment focused on what they termed Type S hematologic differentiation, a cluster of physiological characteristics that appeared consistently across certain family members but not others. The findings were extraordinary. Stress response. Type S individuals exhibited abnormal cortisol regulation. Under extreme stress conditions, their hormone levels dropped rather than spiked, resulting in enhanced cognitive function during crisis situations. Standard fight-or-flight response was replaced by what the document termed cold clarity response. One annotation, handwritten in the margin: Subject C7 exhibited near complete emotional detachment during simulated crisis. Heart rate decreased, pupil dilation reversed, described feeling perfectly calm, like watching from outside. This is not normal stress response. Cellular regeneration. Documented healing rates 40-60% faster than baseline human norms. Scarring minimal or absent in most cases. One subject had recovered from a compound fracture in half. The expected time with bone density measurements showing no evidence of prior injury. The medical examiner's note: "I've been practicing orthopaedic medicine for 30 years. This is not possible. The bone structure shows remodelling that would typically take months, but occurred in weeks. Either our dating methods are wrong, or something in this subject's biology is accelerating cellular repair at rates I cannot explain." Neurological profile. Near complete absence of degenerative brain disorders across 7 generations of tracking. No Alzheimer's, no Parkinson's, no dementia. Average lifespan exceeded regional norms by 12 years. Immune function. Natural immunity to specific viral infections that should have no genetic basis for resistance. Several Type S individuals had been exposed to influenza outbreaks that sickened entire households, but never developed symptoms themselves. Temperature regulation. Baseline body temperature, 1.2 degrees Celsius, lower than human average. Temperature variance under stress conditions exceeded normal human parameters. Ocular characteristics. Noted: unusual reflective quality to iris under specific lighting conditions. 3 subjects exhibited what the examiner described as possible nictitating membrane reflex when startled by sudden stimuli. The examiner's note on this finding: "I thought I was mistaken, but I have now observed this in 3 separate subjects. During startle response, there's a lateral movement across the eye that occurs too quickly for conscious control. It resembles the third eyelid found in reptiles and birds. This should not exist in human anatomy." The document concluded with a section titled Generational Transmission and Activation Patterns. Type S characteristics do not appear in all offspring, suggesting recessive inheritance or conditional expression. Approximately 30% of children from confirmed Type S parents exhibit full phenotype. However, we have documented cases of phenotype emergence in adults who showed no signs in childhood or adolescence. This suggests the Type S classification is not purely genetic in the traditional sense, but may involve activation triggers we have not yet identified. Recommend continued monitoring of Type S individuals and their offspring to determine what environmental or developmental factors trigger full expression. The final note, stamped in red ink: classified, Royal Household Medical Records, unauthorized distribution prohibited. Rebecca cross-referenced the date. 1987. The same year, personal computers began entering middle-class homes across Europe and North America. The same year, cellular networks started expanding beyond experimental urban deployments. Technology. She thought about the Swiss white paper. This helix reacts to electromagnetic signals at frequencies outside standard human neural resonance. Her anonymous correspondent sent a second email while she'd been reading, "Check the 2001 leak, Phase 4. That's when they stopped monitoring and started managing." Rebecca knew exactly what that meant. In 2001, a contractor working for a US intelligence agency had leaked a series of classified briefings to a journalist who'd later died in what was officially ruled a suicide. The leaked documents had covered everything from surveillance programs to foreign policy assessments. Most had been dismissed as conspiracy theory, or redacted into meaninglessness by the time they reached public circulation. But one briefing had stuck in the collective consciousness of researchers who worked in Rebecca's field. It was titled Phase 4, Behavioural Management of Type S Infiltrates. She'd read it years ago during her doctoral research on suppressed intelligence documents, dismissed it as disinformation designed to discredit legitimate leaks. Now she pulled it up again with completely different eyes. The briefing was structured as a strategic assessment, dated March 2001, prepared for select members of a Congressional Intelligence Oversight Committee. The document had been leaked in fragments, complete pages interspersed with sections that had been redacted or destroyed. But enough remained to paint a disturbing picture. Subject: Strategic Assessment. Type S Infiltrate Management. Classification: TS-SCI, No Fawn Executive. Summary: Phase 4 represents the transitional period during which Type S individuals embedded in positions of influence become aware of their differentiated status. Historical precedent suggests this awareness can trigger unpredictable behavioural changes and potential destabilisation of existing power structures. Unlike previous phases focused on identification and monitoring, Phase 4 requires active management protocols to ensure smooth integration of emerging Type S consciousness into existing governance and economic frameworks. Background: Type S infiltrates are not external agents or foreign operatives. They're intergenerational insertions, individuals born human but carrying genetic markers that activate under specific environmental conditions. Many Type S individuals reach adulthood, marry, raise families, and hold positions of significant influence without conscious knowledge of their differentiated status. Redacted section, approximately 2 pages. Identifying characteristics. Physical, variable. Most Type S individuals are phenotypically indistinguishable from baseline humans. However, activation events may trigger subtle physiological changes including altered temperature regulation, enhanced pattern recognition capabilities, abnormal stress response, decreased rather than elevated, rapid healing from injury resistance to specific pathogens. Behavioural. Type S individuals demonstrate consistent patterns across cultural and geographic boundaries, gravitate toward positions of systemic influence, policy, finance, research. Exhibit enhanced capability for long-term strategic thinking. Show reduced emotional volatility in crisis situations. Demonstrate unconscious coordination with other Type S individuals. Express feeling different or separate from baseline humans, often from early childhood. Redacted section, approximately 3 pages. Activation. Triggers. Intelligence assessment has identified 3 primary trigger categories. Technological exposure. Prolonged interaction with advanced computational systems in electromagnetic environments. Correlation between Type S activation events and proximity to high-frequency electromagnetic fields exceeds 78%. Specific frequency ranges, redacted, appear to trigger genetic expression changes. Genetic awakening, proximity to other activated Type S individuals. Subjects report sensing others of their kind, though mechanism remains unclear. May involve electromagnetic sensitivity or pheromone response. Crisis response. Extreme stress or survival situations that force physiological differentiation to manifest. multiple documented cases of latent Type S individuals exhibiting enhanced capabilities during life-threatening situations, followed by partial or full awareness of their differentiated status. Phase 4. Characteristics. Phase 4 begins when a critical mass of Type S individuals become aware of their differentiated status. Current intelligence suggests we are entering Phase 4 now. Indicators include increased private communication networks among confirmed Type S individuals, formation of informal alliance structures across political and national boundaries, attempts to access classified research on S-helix genetic markers, increased interest in historical records regarding redacted strategic implications. Traditional security frameworks are inadequate for addressing emergent Type S consciousness. These individuals are not hostile foreign actors. They are embedded in critical infrastructure, political leadership, scientific research, and cultural influence positions. Many have security clearances. Some have access to classified information regarding their own status. Forceful containment or exposure strategies carry unacceptable risk. Type S individuals in intelligence positions could leak classified information. Type S individuals in policy positions could destabilize governance structures. Coordinated Type S response to persecution could trigger redacted. Public exposure could trigger mass panic and social destabilization. Recommended management approach. Phase 4. Management should focus on controlled integration rather than containment or exposure. Objectives. Monitor Type S communication networks without triggering defensive responses. Provide limited, controlled disclosure to select Type S individuals to prevent independent information gathering. Establish informal liaison protocols with cooperative Type S individuals in key positions. Prepare public for eventual broader disclosure through gradual normalization, redacted, approximately 1 page. Conclusion. Type S individuals are not the enemy. Intelligence assessment indicates their emergence serves a broader function related to species-level adaptation and technological integration. Their capabilities may prove necessary for humanity's transition to redacted. Premature exposure or forceful containment could trigger defensive protocols we are not equipped to handle. Recommend patience, observation, and strategic cooperation. Redacted section, final page. Rebecca read through the document twice, then cross-referenced it with the information she had gathered. The year the intelligence community officially acknowledged that people with the S-helix variant were starting to become aware of what they were. The year the strategy shifted from monitor to manage, 24 years ago. Which meant that right now, in 2025, they were deep into Phase 4, possibly approaching Phase 5. She thought about the case studies in the genetic white paper. People who described unusual clarity and pattern recognition. People who'd said it felt like they were interfacing with code instead of just reading it. People who didn't know they were different, just knew they were unusually good at what they did. What happened when those people found out why? Rebecca opened her encrypted messaging app and sent a query to a contact she'd cultivated over years of archival work. A former intelligence analyst who'd left the NSA under circumstances that remained unclear, but who still maintained connections in the community. Her message: Phase 4, Type S. What's the current assessment? The response came back in under a minute. You're playing with fire, stop. Rebecca typed, I need to know. 3 minutes passed. Then, Phase 4 went operational in 2003. Phase 5 is already active. You don't want to know what Phase 6 looks like. Seriously, delete everything and walk away. What's Phase 5? Another long pause. Then, integration. They're not hiding anymore. Some of them know what they are, and they're starting to work together. I can't tell you more. I won't tell you more. This is me, as your friend, telling you to stop before you get disappeared like Victor. They killed him for giving you that USB drive. They'll kill you for using it. The chat went offline. Rebecca sat in the Amsterdam cafe, surrounded by ordinary people living ordinary lives, while the foundations of everything she thought she understood about human civilization crumbled beneath her. Phase 5 was active, integration. People with the S-helix variant, people who'd been living as humans their entire lives, were waking up, becoming aware and starting to coordinate. The question wasn't whether this was happening. The documents made that clear. The question was what they wanted, and what would happen when enough of them were awake. The security footage was never supposed to exist. Rebecca found it 3 days later, buried in the anonymous file dump that had been steadily growing in her inbox. Someone was feeding her information, someone with access to materials that should have been destroyed decades ago. Someone who wanted her to know the truth, or wanted someone to know, and she was the conduit. The footage was dated August 14th, 2016. Location: a private conference facility outside Caracas, Venezuela. The context was a high-level crisis meeting involving energy ministers, military leadership, and international advisors during Venezuela's economic collapse. The meeting had been recorded using standard security cameras for standard security reasons, but someone had also been running thermal imaging equipment, likely as an additional security measure to detect concealed weapons, unauthorized personnel, or unusual heat signatures that might indicate explosive devices. That thermal equipment had recorded something that defied explanation. The footage showed exactly what you'd expect for the first 90 minutes. Human-shaped heat signatures clustered around a long conference table. Body temperatures ranging from 36.5 to 37.2 degrees Celsius. Normal human variance. People sat, stood, gestured, argued, all perfectly ordinary through the thermal camera's lens. Then, at the 1:34 to 22 mark, something changed. One attendee, seated at the head of the table, identified in the accompanying file notes as a European financial advisor to the Venezuelan government, exhibited a sudden and dramatic temperature drop. Within 45 seconds, their surface temperature fell from 36.8 to 31.70, 5 degrees Celsius. The thermal camera clearly showed the change. The individual's heat signature shifted from warm orange-red to cool blue-green. Not gradually. Not the slow cooling that might occur if someone was in shock or hypothermic. Rapidly, deliberately. Like their body had simply decided to regulate temperature in a way that violated basic human physiology. The timestamp corresponded with a heated argument visible in the standard footage. Raised voices, accusations, the kind of high-stress confrontation that should trigger elevated heart rate, flushed skin, increased body temperature. Instead, this person's temperature had plummeted, and their body language became unnaturally calm, precise, controlled. 3 minutes later, their temperature normalized. The argument ended. The meeting continued. The file notes indicated the footage had been flagged immediately by security analysts, escalated to intelligence oversight within hours, and permanently sealed within 72 hours. The financial advisor had left Venezuela the following day and disappeared from all public records. Rebecca found a follow-up memo dated 2 weeks after the incident. Subject relocated to undisclosed European location. Medical evaluation confirms Type S activation event. Subject now aware of differentiated status. Recommend Phase 5 integration protocols. Subject cooperative, and has agreed to voluntary monitoring in exchange for information access regarding origin and purpose of S-helix variant. They'd made a deal. The person who'd manifested impossible physiology on camera had been given answers in exchange for cooperation. Rebecca wondered what those answers were. What did they tell people when they woke up and realised they weren't entirely human? Her anonymous source sent another compilation. This one was dozens of incident reports spanning 3 decades, all documenting similar thermal anomalies. 1991, Private Estate, Scotland. Security personnel report, unusual cold zones detected in the master bedroom suite despite functional heating. Thermal survey shows temperature differential of 3-4 degrees Celsius, concentrated around sleeping area. Estate owner, member of prominent banking family, dismisses concerns. Follow-up investigation terminated at owner's request. 1998, Manhattan penthouse. Building maintenance receives multiple complaints about HVAC malfunction in specific units. Residents report feeling overheated while thermostats register temperatures 2-3 degrees lower than surrounding apartments. Technical inspection finds no mechanical issues. Residents are all from same extended family network. pattern noted but unexplained. 2004, Geneva Diplomatic Compound. Infrared security sweeps detect cold signatures around 3 specific individuals during high-level trade negotiations. Security team suspects equipment malfunction. Equipment tested and confirmed functional. Individuals show no signs of illness or distress. Incident classified. 2009, Dubai Financial Summit. Private security firm contracted for VIP protection reports. Unusual thermal readings on multiple attendees. Several high-profile executives register surface temperatures 1-2 degrees below expected human baseline. Firm's report submitted to clients, then immediately classified. Security team members sign expanded NDAs. 2012, London Banking District. Corporate security investigating potential industrial espionage uses thermal imaging during board meetings. Discovers 3 board members consistently register abnormally low surface temperatures during high-stress discussions. Investigation redirected by unknown authority. All thermal footage confiscated. 2016, Washington political fundraiser. Secret Service thermal scanning detects unusual temperature patterns in multiple attendees. Several prominent political figures show decreased surface temperature during public speaking and high-pressure social interactions. Anomalies noted in after-action report but not investigated further. The pattern was undeniable. These weren't equipment malfunctions. These were people whose bodies responded to stress and electromagnetic environments in ways that violated understood human biology. And then there were the eyes. Rebecca found a separate file containing compiled reports from security personnel, journalists, personal assistants, and even entertainment industry professionals. Dozens of observations, each dismissed individually, but forming an impossible pattern when viewed together. Subject's eyes reflected amber gold under camera flash, similar to animal eye shine, assumed to be lighting artifact. Photographer, 2008. During night vision surveillance, subject's eyes showed reflective quality not consistent with human eye structure. Equipment tested and confirmed functional. Private security report, 2011. I could swear I saw his eyes blink sideways, like not up and down, but from the side. But that's impossible, so I must have imagined it. Political aid, anonymous interview, 2015. Under UV security lighting, several VIP guests exhibited unusual iris reflection patterns. Copper or gold coloration not typical of human eyes under these conditions. Event security log, 2019. The senator's eyes. There was something wrong. During the press conference, when the lights hit him at a certain angle, I saw something move across his eye, horizontally. My colleague saw it too. We both pretended we didn't. Camera operator, confidential testimony. 2021, nictitating membranes. Third eyelids. Reflective tapetum lucidum like nocturnal predators possessed. Biological features that didn't exist in human anatomy. Except they did. In some people, under the right conditions, when stress or environment triggered something dormant to activate. Rebecca's phone rang. Actual voice call, not encrypted message. She stared at it for 3 rings before answering. You need to stop digging. The voice was female, American accent, eerily calm. For your own safety. Rebecca's mouth went dry. Who is this? Someone who's been where you are. Someone who knows what happens when you keep pulling threads. What happens? A long pause. Background noise suggested the caller was outside, wind across the microphone, distant traffic. You start seeing patterns everywhere. You start questioning everyone around you. You start wondering if your boss, your neighbour, your lover, if any of them are carrying markers they don't even know about. The paranoia eats you alive, Rebecca. And the worst part... Rebecca waited, her heart hammering. The worst part is, you'll never know if you're paranoid or if you're right. Because they don't know either. Most of them live their whole lives without ever finding out what they are. They just know they're good at what they do. They just know they handle stress better than other people. They just know they see patterns others miss. And they never question it, because why would they? Are you... Rebecca started. One of them? I don't know. That's what I'm trying to tell you. I had the test done. Private lab. Cost me $20,000 and 3. Years of saved favours. You want to know what they told me? What? They told me the test was inconclusive. They told me the markers were there but dormant. They told me I might be carrying a helix variant or I might not, and there was no way to know unless it activated. And you know what that means? Rebecca did know. You'll never know if your successes are yours or if there's something else driving you. Exactly. I'm a federal judge, Rebecca. I make decisions that affect millions of lives. And now I'll spend the rest of my career wondering if my judgment is mine, or if there's something in my DNA pushing me toward outcomes I don't consciously understand. That's what this knowledge does. It poisons everything. But people deserve to know, do they? What happens when you publish your research? When you tell the world that 14 bloodlines carry non-human DNA? That some of the most powerful people in the world might be a different species and don't even know it? You think that ends well? The truth matters. The woman laughed, bitter and harsh. The truth is that whatever the seraphim were, they're woven so deep into human civilization that you can't separate us anymore. Their descendants are everywhere, in government, in corporations, in universities and hospitals and military command. And most of them are good people trying to do good work. What happens to them when you expose this? They get hunted, tested, quarantined, or worse, they get worshipped, turned into messiahs or demons. Either way, you tear society apart. Is that what you want? I want people to understand what's happening to them. Then you're naive. Victor died trying to get you this information. You think he wanted you to publish it? He wanted you to understand it, to be ready, because Phase 5 isn't about exposure, it's about preparation. Preparation for what? The line went dead. Rebecca sat in the dark of her Amsterdam hotel room, staring at thermal footage of impossible biology and witness reports of inhuman eyes, and realised she'd crossed a threshold she couldn't return from. The French intelligence analyst made contact through a dead drop in Paris. Rebecca travelled there following a coded message slipped under her hotel door. Inside a locker at Gare du Nord, she found a micro SD card and a handwritten note. What you're looking for isn't conquest, it's cultivation. A friend in the directorate. The SD card contained an audio recording, a debriefing session from 2018, conducted in French. Rebecca listened while running translation software. The speaker identified himself only as Asian Mathieu, 15 years in French foreign intelligence. Interviewer: You mentioned a rumour circulating among senior political handlers. Elaborate. Mathieu: Not discussed openly, more like shared understanding among people in these positions long enough. We all noticed patterns. Officials who predict policy shifts before they happen, who navigate crises with inhuman calm, who maintain influence across administrations regardless of political changes. Interviewer: Competence could. Mathieu: Not competence. Something else. A colleague, 23 years at the ministry, told me after too much wine. The seraphim aren't here to conquer. They're here to ensure the planet evolves in a direction compatible with them. Interviewer: Compatible with what? Mathieu: That's the question. Compatible with what they are, what they're becoming. They don't interfere with democracy, they designed it, built the frameworks we operate within, not conspiracy. Architecture, like designing a garden to grow specific plants. Interviewer: You believe this? Mathieu. Pause. I believe there are people in power who think on timescales we can't fathom, working toward objectives that won't be clear for generations. Whether they're consciously aware of being different or if it's instinctive, I don't know, but the difference is real. Rebecca played it again, focusing on one phrase. They designed the systems. The helix responded to electromagnetic frequencies, appeared in bloodlines maintaining power for centuries, activated in response to technology. What if it wasn't reactive but anticipatory? What if these carriers weren't responding to technology, but unconsciously driving humanity toward the thresholds that would trigger their activation? Democracy, capitalism, digital networks, AI. Every major system structuring modern civilization, developed by people possibly carrying genetic programming they didn't know existed. Not conspiracy, architecture. Rebecca found the next piece. A partial transcript from a 1974 Bilderberg conference. Unknown speaker. A. The integration timeline assumes continued technological acceleration. If we encounter resistance. Unknown speaker. B. We won't. The pattern is self-reinforcing. Each generation requires more connection, more processing, more interface. They think they're choosing progress. They are, just not for the reasons they believe. Speaker A. When they realise? Speaker B. They won't. By the time enough realise, it won't matter. Systems too integrated, too essential. You can't unplug from infrastructure that keeps you alive. Speaker C. Some will resist. Speaker B. Resistance is part of the design. Creates pressure that accelerates adoption. Resistors aren't obstacles, they're catalysts. Speaker A. Very confident. Speaker B. Very patient. Not a 10-year plan, a 1,000-year implementation. We designed representative government, electoral systems, the frameworks within which choice occurs. The choices themselves are irrelevant as long as the framework endures. A 1,000-year implementation. Rebecca thought about ancient texts, Mesopotamian tablets describing seraphim going beneath. The instruction across cultures, preserve the bloodline. What if it never ended? What if they'd simply changed strategies, stopped ruling openly and built systems that would rule for them? Systems ensuring humanity developed exactly as needed to trigger whatever was encoded in the S-helix. Systems making their emergence not an invasion, but an awakening. Her phone buzzed. You're close. One more piece. Check your email. The email contained a single PDF. NATO, Strategic, Briefing, Seraphim, Protocol 2023, PDF. The NATO briefing was dated October 2023, marked Cosmic Top Secret. Subject: Strategic Assessment, Seraphim Protocol Activation Timeline. Executive Summary. Recent advances in AI, neural interfaces, and global electromagnetic saturation have triggered measurable S-helix activation increases among monitored populations. Analysis indicates humanity is approaching technological thresholds identified in historical Seraphim documentation as return protocol initialization. Key findings: activation has increased 340% since 2020. Correlation with AI interaction, 5G deployment, and neural interfacing devices exceeds 89%. Activated individuals demonstrate enhanced pattern recognition, accelerated learning, and what subjects describe as expanded systemic awareness. Most remain unaware of physiological differentiation. Activated S-helix carriers demonstrate unconscious coordination in policy, technology investment, and social engineering. Emergent collective behaviour, not conscious conspiracy. Current rates suggest 15-20% of carriers will achieve full phenotype expression by 2030. Historical documentation suggests this represents critical threshold for return protocol completion. Historical context. Recovered Seraphim documentation indicates original departure was strategic hibernation, not retreat. Genetic architecture designed to remain dormant until humanity achieved sufficient technological sophistication for full Seraphim integration. The S-helix isn't infection, it's preparation. Strategic implications. Traditional security frameworks inadequate. Subjects embedded in critical infrastructure. Political leadership. Scientific research. Cultural influence. Born human. Raised human. Many live and die without activation. Those who activate aren't hostile. Assessment indicates Seraphim agenda aligns with long-term human survival, though definition of human may require revision. Conclusion. Humanity will reach technological thresholds in 5 to 10 years, triggering widespread S-helix activation. Enhanced AI, brain-computer interfaces, global neural networks, not coincidental. These are environmental conditions Seraphim genetic architecture was designed to respond to. The briefing concluded with a final slide. There is no invasion. They are already born. They are waking up. Beneath it, recommended response. Monitor and adapt. Integration inevitable. Resistance counterproductive. Rebecca closed her laptop. Around her, people worked on devices that might be triggering something ancient in genetics, of people they'd known their entire lives. 14 bloodlines, centuries of careful breeding, systems of power immune to change. Technological acceleration everyone assumed was human progress. What if it was? What if some humans had been guiding this trajectory since the beginning? What if democracy, capitalism, technological progress, digital interconnection weren't human achievements influenced by others, but seraphim achievements implemented through human consciousness, through people who believed themselves human until conditions awakened what had always slept inside them? Her phone buzzed. Genesis. Protocol. Verified a proton.me. You found what Victor died to give you. Now choose. Publish and trigger panic, or wait and watch. Either way, you can't stop what's waking up. We've been waking since you invented fire, since you built cities, since you split the atom. Each threshold brings us closer to what we were always meant to become. You're not being invaded, you're being remembered. Some of us remember better than others. Soon, enough will remember, and then you'll understand. There was never separation. No aliens among you. Only humans who haven't woken yet, and humans who have. Welcome to Phase 5. Rebecca sat very still. In the corner, a woman in a business suit worked on a laptop, fingers moving with mechanical precision. In the right light, her eyes reflected copper. The woman glanced up, met Rebecca's gaze for exactly 1 second, then returned to work. Rebecca looked away, heart pounding. She opened a new document, titled it the Seraphim Program, started typing. She had no idea if anyone would believe her, no idea if publication would change anything, or if the systems were too embedded, too essential to resist. But she typed anyway, because somewhere in 14 bloodlines spread across the world, people were waking to what they'd always been. People in government, corporations, research labs, people who'd lived human lives never knowing they carried something older than civilization, people who were starting to remember, and if the briefing was correct, within a decade enough would be awake that the world would change in unpredictable ways. Maybe that's what evolution looked like. Not external invasion, but internal awakening. Not war between species, but recognition that categories were never as clear as humanity believed. Rebecca kept typing as the sun set over Paris, painting the sky copper and gold. Behind her, the woman in the business suit closed her laptop and left. Her surface temperature, had anyone been measuring, would have registered 35.9 degrees Celsius, 1 degree below normal, and falling. In boardrooms and laboratories, in government offices and university lecture halls, in hospital operating rooms and military command centres, people who'd never questioned their humanity were beginning to feel different, beginning to see patterns invisible to others, beginning to recognise each other across distances that should make recognition impossible, beginning to wake. And the systems they'd built, democracy, capitalism, technology, networks, continued functioning exactly as designed. Not as human systems influenced by hidden forces, but as seraphim systems implemented through human hands, preparing the world for a transformation that had been set in motion 4,000 years ago. Rebecca typed the final line. They're already among us. They always have been, and they are us. She hit save, encrypted the file, sent copies to 3 separate secure servers. Then she walked out into the Paris night, knowing that nothing would ever look the same again. Above her, satellites circled the Earth, transmitting signals at frequencies that made the invisible visible. And in 14 bloodlines scattered across continents, DNA that had waited millennia began to unfold, listening, responding, waking. The Seraphim Protocol was entering its final phase, and humanity, all of humanity, was about to discover what that meant.